Hey everyone, just a reminder to subscribe. Does a single act of rage make you an evil person? The prosecutor objected, and a lawyer with silver hair paced back and forth in front of the witness stand as he thought about how to rephrase his ambiguous question. He was one of the best money could buy, with an intimidating presence that was only clarified the moment he opened his mouth. It was a prime example of how money plays such a big role in deciding the outcome in our justice system. The jury only needs reasonable doubt to throw the case, even if all the evidence clearly points in one direction. When he stopped in front of the stand again, he asked, "Do you believe my client is capable of offending again?" Yes, we were all friends, but I didn't know Aiden like my husband Nathan did. He was asked the same question when it was his turn to get grilled on the witness stand. Nathan's opinion of Aiden would be held in higher regard and impact the jury's verdict far more than my testimony. They were work buddies and spent nearly every day around each other at the office. Could this be enough to make a decision if Aiden was capable of murder? There'd only been a handful of events that we all spent together as couples before the Florida trip, and I personally never saw anything that made me raise my eyebrows. Cora was a lovely woman on all accounts and a wonderful hostess when we'd visit. They weren't big drinkers, neither were we, but there were a few times that we finished more than one bottle together. They were a delight to be around and looked to be best friends. We wouldn't have even considered such a big trip with them believing otherwise. But when Aiden invited us to go island hopping in the Florida Keys, we were excited to go. It was planned to be a 5-day trip. Aiden rented a 32-foot Catalina sailboat that held the four of us comfortably. Our first day we all met in Key Largo. Aiden and Cora took a later flight than us, so while we waited, Nathan and I took time to get lunch and explore the town. It was a little after 2 when we all got together. We spent the next couple of hours loading provisions and luggage onto the sailboat, and then we spent the rest of the day reef snorkeling, drinking, and chain smoking. Not all at the same time. The drinking and smoking came after the snorkeling. The first night felt like the beginning to a picturesque vacation. We were all excited for the days to come. The next day, Aiden got us all the way to Marathon, and that night we anchored near the Molasses Keys, and we felt our first taste of true isolation. No more glow of nearby towns on the horizon. I didn't know how much the distant light gave me a sense of ease. Not like I would have been able to swim there if an emergency were to occur. It was more the assurance that the world still existed. It's probably just my brain, but it's why I enjoy listening to the traffic update on the radio. I can't be sure that the news portion I hear isn't on a pre-recorded loop, but the traffic update is live, telling me the world's still spinning. The open water prides itself on humbling a human significance in the world. I'd never been so far from civilization, and as much as I tried to ignore the encroaching pit I had, no amount of music, laughter, or drinking could let me fully relax. As well as being a skilled sailor, Aiden was also well-traveled when it came to mixing drinks. I'd hardly drank enough to feel as woozy as I did that night, whether it be the motion of the ocean or the fact that it had been years since I'd partied multiple days in a row like that. I was the first to call it a night. Nathan joined me soon after. In Nathan's statement, he said that Aiden and Cora were slow dancing and having their own little moment at the front of the boat. He felt like a third wheel just standing out there watching them, so joined me down inside the boat. The next morning, Nathan and I were woken up when we heard Aiden running around the boat in an absolute panic. Nathan ran up first, and Aiden started immediately directing him step by step how to assist him with the sail, and he jumped into action. As I sat up, I realized I was the only one still in the sleeping area. All of the other beds were empty. I quickly got dressed, found my shoes, and went to join everyone on the deck. Both men looked like they had their hands full tossing ropes around a thing and doing whatever they were doing to secure it to the mast. It was clear that something bad had happened during the time I'd been sleeping and woken up again. Aiden had long serrated gashes that stretched down his face and bare chest, as if he'd walked through a glass window. I glanced around to see if I could find any broken glass lying around, but as I scanned, all I saw was more blood, footprints, handprints on the wood and walls of the sailboat. It looked like the splashing waves of the ocean had washed most of it off, but the water that stayed behind, puddled in a murky pink swirl of seawater and blood, gathered at the rough textured floor. That's also when I noticed Cora wasn't up on the deck with us. I went down below again to make sure I didn't miss her, sleeping in a weird area. But she was nowhere to be found. From above, I can hear Aiden shout about how the anchor on the sailboat hadn't fastened onto anything. Or whatever it had stuck to broke because it dragged on the ocean floor and let our sailboat drift for an unknown distance, off course. He looked physically drained and battered from trying to wrangle the sails down by himself before Nathan jumped in. I described Aiden's demeanor as genuine to the court. Tears poured down his cheeks when he told us that he couldn't find Cora when he woke up, and he feared that she fell overboard after they passed out. Aiden woke up again when the anchor tugged on something from below and shook the boat. That's when he discovered Cora to be missing, and the anchor mishap, all at the same time. It took us a while to get him settled down enough to make a plan. Aiden was the only one who knew how to read the information on the equipment, but watching him touch the buttons and squint at the screen resembled a student slowly reading the question to a test they hadn't studied for, rather than the confident captain we'd set sail with. Suddenly, Aiden wasn't sure what anything meant. He didn't give us details on why the instruments were malfunctioning, but he opted to only use a compass to get us back to the keys. The only problem with that was depending on how far we drifted in the 5 or 6 hours we'd been asleep. We ran the risk of overshooting them, getting ourselves more stranded in the Gulf. Without a radio transmitter or radar working, we had no choice but to trust Aiden when he told us this way was our only real option. Our acceleration was based purely off of wind and long drafts of a current that were few and far between. The sun went up and down around us 2 more times before we'd see buildings silhouetted in the horizon as the sun set for the second round. The next morning, as it rose again above our shoulders, the windows shined like distant crystals. Aiden managed to stay awake the whole time, and the fatigue had taken its toll on his mental health. The lawyer with silver hair made that a focal point to the defense when they addressed the other recorded statements that Nathan and I made to the cops when we got to shore. Both he and I saw Aiden have bouts of manic delusions where he'd shout and curse at the water. He said, "Can't you see? Cora's following the boat." He said that he couldn't stop seeing her trailing in the wake behind the boat. His cries would turn from banishing her spirit away to deep, sorrowful apologies. Under oath, I swore I heard Aiden beg her for forgiveness and to stop haunting him. Nathan told the jury that Aiden admitted to, quote, doing something really bad to Cora, but never specified as to what he meant. He'd deny ever saying such things. When the sailboat made it to shore, we'd landed on the coast of the Boca Chica Beach Park. When the boat got close enough to the shore, Nathan jumped off the side and swam the rest of the way to get help. There was a helicopter search conducted, but Nothing of Cora's was ever recovered. Aiden was detained right off the boat, but wasn't held for long. He pled not guilty and was able to beat the case. Nathan and Aiden never spoke again outside of the courtroom. They avoided each other at work until Aiden left the company. So, does a single act of rage make you an evil person? I think there was already an evil inside, if it was that easy for him to act on it in such a Machiavellian, premeditated way. I stayed at my aunt's house for 6 weeks the winter after my divorce, mostly because she didn't ask questions and because the place sat far enough from town that no one accidentally stopped by. It was one of those coastal houses built before people cared about flood zones, perched on short stilts and angled toward an inlet that emptied out almost completely at low tide. When the water pulled back, it didn't just reveal sand, it exposed a wide basin of silt and rock that smelled like metal and rot. Eelgrass lay flattened in dark streaks, and shallow pools formed wherever the ground dipped, each one reflecting the sky. Locals called this spot the Axis. At low tide, you could walk nearly half a mile across the basin to a cluster of rocks on the far side. People did it all the time. Shellfish collectors, dog walkers, kids looking for crabs. The tide charts were taped to the fridge, written in my aunt's careful handwriting. And everyone I spoke to treated the flats like a harmless convenience, rather than what they were, a place temporarily abandoned by the sea. The first week I only watched. I'd sit on the back steps with a mug of coffee and watch the water drain away, the shoreline retreating inch by inch until the inlet looked a lot less like a body of water and more like a wound that hadn't closed yet. The process was slow. No waves or drama, just absence. I started walking the flats during the second week I was there. I told myself it was good for me. Fresh air, solitude, somewhere to put my thoughts where they wouldn't echo back quite so loudly. The ground surprised me. It was firmer than it looked. Packed sand and silt holding its shape under my boots. Each step made a quiet suction sound. Wet, but not unstable. I found myself watching my feet as I walked, following the repeating pattern of prints, letting the rhythm numb me. But then I noticed other tracks. They were wide, not impossibly so, but wider than any human boot I'd ever seen. Too deep for the weight they suggested. Pressed cleanly into the mud without drag marks or signs of slipping. And they didn't wander or loop like someone exploring. They went straight out toward the center of the basin. I stopped and looked back toward the shore. My aunt's house was already smaller than I expected. The steps barely distinguishable from the rocks around it. The tide chart said that I had hours left. I followed the tracks. They led me to a shallow pool maybe 10 feet across. The water inside it darker than the surrounding flats, almost black. The surface was unnaturally smooth, reflecting the gray sky so clearly it felt solid. I stood at the edge of it for a long time. Something shifted beneath the surface. It wasn't fast or sudden, just enough to disturb the reflection, like a large body turning slowly in sleep. I didn't scream or jump back. What I felt first was recognition, not of what it was, but of the situation itself. The instinctive understanding that whatever was under the water knew exactly where I was standing. The shape rose closer to the surface without breaking it. A face formed just beneath the waterline, distorted but unmistakable. Forward-facing eyes, the suggestion of a nose. a mouth that wasn't moving, but skin that looked so thin, almost translucent, stretched across bone. Pale in a way that suggested that it rarely ever met the air. It didn't seem trapped. And that was the thought that cut through everything else. This wasn't a stranded animal waiting for rescue. The pool wasn't its limit. It was waiting for the water to come back. So I took a step backward. The surface of the pool bulged upward, tension building without breaking, like something pressing from below. I felt like I could see a hand-shaped shadow appear beneath the water, fingers spreading slowly, deliberately, touching the underside of the surface, as if testing it. I felt watched, in a way that had nothing to do with being hunted, just, I was sure. The hand withdrew. The water stilled. I continued to walk back toward the shore without turning around. Every step, I waited to hear the sound of something emerging from the water for good. So I moved carefully, as if any sudden motion might read as an invitation to do so. Behind me, the pool remained smooth and dark. I didn't tell my aunt what I'd seen. I didn't need to. She warned me that evening to keep an eye on the tide. Her voice was casual. Her eyes were lingering on the inlet longer than necessary. Just seems they've been coming in faster lately, she said. People get careless. Don't be one of them. A week later, a man from the next town over got stranded on the flats when the tide rushed back in ahead of schedule. They found his boots near the far rocks, toes pointed toward the shore. Nothing else. The news called it an accident. I'm not sure, but I never went back into the access. Even now, years later, I hear people talk about low tide walks like they're harmless, and maybe in some places they are. But I think about that pool, the way that it didn't chase me, but that there was something patient in that water, waiting. I wonder how many people mistake that patience for safety. I wasn't a first responder. I want to be clear about that. I was just the guy who lived closest to the river. When the call went out over the neighborhood Facebook group that someone had gone under near the old footbridge, I grabbed a flashlight and ran. It was instinct more than heroism. That stretch of water had always been part of our lives. Kids skipping stones, teenagers drinking on the banks, people letting dogs off the leash like nothing bad could ever happen there. By the time I got there, the police were already setting up tape, and the fire department had pulled in their trucks. No sirens, just headlights cutting through the fog, and the low, constant sound of the river moving fast from the recent rain. A woman stood on the bank screaming a name I didn't recognize. Someone said that a man had slipped while trying to cross the rocks. Another said that he'd jumped in after a dog. Stories change fast when people are scared. A firefighter asked if anyone had an extra light. I raised my hand without thinking. That's how I ended up standing shoulder to shoulder with people who knew exactly what they were doing, and me, who absolutely did not. They had divers suiting up, but it takes time. Water like that doesn't forgive rushing. Until then, they had us all scanning the surface, looking for bubbles, movement, anything that suggested where the body might have gone. I swept my beam back and forth across the water. The river was higher than normal, swollen, dark, but it wasn't chaotic. It moved with purpose, sliding around the rocks instead of crashing into them. And then I caught a glimpse of something that didn't move with the current. At first, I thought it was debris, a jacket maybe, something caught between submerged branches. I adjusted the angle, narrowing the beam. It was a person, or part of one. The shape was vertical beneath the surface, suspended rather than drifting. Pale fabric clung to it, unmoving, as if the water wasn't touching it the way it should. I said something, I don't remember what, just noise to get attention. One of the firefighters leaned in beside me, following my beam. He stiffened. "That's not right," he said quietly. Before he could say more, the shape moved, not downstream, but down. The water around it tightened, compressing inward like something below had shifted its grip. My light shook in my hands as the shape sank straight out of sight, leaving behind nothing but a smooth, dark surface. No disturbance or bubbles. The firefighter took the flashlight from me gently, like he was afraid I might drop it. They found the man 2 hours later, wedged against a rock farther down the river than anyone expected. The official explanation was the current, undertow panic. Everyone nodded along because that's what people do when the alternative is too strange. And maybe what me and that firefighter had seen is not related, but no one asked me to describe what I'd seen. In the days after, I told myself that adrenaline had warped my perception, that water does weird things to light, that shock fills in the gaps with imagination, that me and that firefighter likely didn't even see the same thing. But sometimes I remember the stillness around that shape, just what it looked like the river seemed to pause around it entirely. I don't run towards emergencies all the time, but I did that day. So I guess I was meant to see whatever it was that I saw, though I really don't wish to see it again. I never told this story out loud the way it actually happened. I've told versions of it, safe versions. The kind where nothing strange occurred and I was just another passenger who happened to be nearby when something went wrong. This isn't that version, though. I was on the evening ferry, heading back across the Sound. It wasn't crowded. Commuters, a few tourists, a couple families trying to keep kids from leaning over the rail. I stood on the lower deck because it was cooler there. About 10 minutes into the crossing, a man climbed over the railing. At first, I thought he was leaning too far. People do that all the time. Then his center of gravity shifted in a way that didn't look accidental. He didn't slip. He went over on purpose. There were shouts. Someone screamed. The ferry slowed. Alarms sounding. Crew moving fast in practice like they trained for this exact thing. I stayed at the rail. I don't know why. The man surfaced once, farther back than I expected. The wake should have carried him away from the hull, but he was closer than made sense, his head bobbing in the churned water. He looked calm, not peaceful, but focused. Then the water around him started to change. It was as if something underneath him had shifted and was starting to pull him under. His expression changed instantly. What was previously focused was now a man who kicked hard. His arm slapped the water, not panicked, but desperate in a way that suggested resistance rather than fear. Then he stopped moving, not slowly, not like someone tiring, like something had made a decision. The crew threw flotation devices. The ferry cut the engines. The rescue boat was lowered within minutes, but they never found him. The official report said strong currents. I think I even read hypothermia. But I watched his body get pulled straight down, which means Something pulled him. I think most of us weren't important enough to interview or something. I know I wasn't. I wasn't injured. I wasn't family. I was just someone standing close enough to see what the water did. For weeks afterward, I replayed it, trying to adjust the memory into something explainable and less morbid. I tried to make it fit the version everyone else accepted. But unlike the details in the press, the details in my mind never changed. I don't know. It was all around a strange, horrifying experience. I still take ferries. I have to, for work. But I tend to stand inside now. I have this morbid memory from when I was 6 years old. I was on a boat with my parents' friends. I guess it was a yacht because they were able to fit a lot of us on there. Anyway, at some point, a lot of the adults had gone swimming. I remember sitting inside and looking out the windows at the adults. Part of me really wanted to swim, and I remember asking my mom if I could. She, of course, told me I couldn't. Not only was it not safe, but I get the feel that this was more of an adult party, and I was just sort of meant to stay in this room. In this room were 2 other kids, about my age, and we all found enough to do to stay occupied, but I kept finding myself walking over to the window and watching outside. I remember the younger kid kept taking the colors I was using, so I just ended up giving it to him and walking away, finding my place by the window. I remember suddenly seeing something unusual. There was a woman. She was swimming next to a man. It was obvious that where we were, you couldn't touch the ground. It was quite deep. But suddenly, I watched as her body seemed to lift in the air slightly, and then ragdoll from side to side, before going under briefly and popping back up. I remember thinking, how can someone stand or project themselves like that? It really seemed like magic, because I didn't know the horror that was happening when I saw it. The woman was being attacked by a shark. I'd be lying if I said I remembered all of the panic that ensued afterwards, but I don't. I just remember being told to stay in the room, the door being closed, the windows being shut. Just me and 2 other kids listening to a bunch of adults scream and cry from the outside. My next real memory is being back on shore. The lady didn't die. She just got a nasty bite on her hip. Apparently, emergency services came and picked her up off the boat before we even made it back to shore. All us children shielded from this madness. All except for me in the initial moment. But, like I said, it just sort of looked like magic. I spent the first half of my life thinking I was going to be a professional figure skater. It wasn't my dream, however, it was my father's dream that he vicariously imprinted on me. I only discovered I hated the sport when I was done participating. Skating was all I ever knew since I could form memories. Every morning, my dad woke me up before the sun had risen. The ice skating rink was open early, and I'd put in at least an hour of practice every morning before school. I was good, and I won a lot of competitions, so much so that a photographer from Fairfax got in contact with my dad. He worked for an independent sports magazine and said that he'd pay us $500 for a photo shoot out on Lake Champlain. The article was going to be about the young up-and-coming athletes hailing from Vermont. The man on the phone said that if they picked me for the cover, we'd receive an extra $200, though sadly none of that money would get to be claimed by us, and none of the photos that we'd taken would ever be published. Not because the people at the magazine didn't like them. They'd actually never see them. Nobody would, because the film, the camera, and its cameraman all sunk to the bottom of the lake, right in front of us. I'm assuming our cash was also in his pocket when he went under, but it feels tasteless to mention that aspect of it as a point of contention because of the circumstances. My dad refused to talk about it to anyone, and he stuck with the story that he told police all the way until his deathbed. I think he was able to convince himself of the lie as well, after adamantly denying the truth over all those years. I understand his reasons and truly don't know where we could have brought our claims and had them taken seriously, let alone serious enough for people to send research teams and spend money investigating it. Okay, so here we go. The photographer's name was Daniel. He was younger than my dad, mid-20s and oh so handsome. I remember he looked just like Mark McGrath with those frosted tips. He wasn't nearly as nice as he was when he had first talked to my dad on the phone. When he got out of the car, my kid brain thought that he was that brooding artist vibe, but retrospectively, he was just kind of rude. Snapping his fingers to get our attention, Daniel handed me an outfit that I'd be wearing for the photo shoot, and while he ordered my dad around, helping him set up the lights, I changed behind the car. We were in an isolated area, closer to the edge of the lake that connects to the river. Daniel wanted to get these shots on as thin of ice as possible, without it being too dangerous for us to stand on. To the man's credit, he found a beautiful spot where the ice looked like foggy glass on the lake, and then the sun peeked delicately over the trees. It was truly magical to soak in. Then lights, camera, action. Daniel sashayed around with his camera, taking a few shots at a time, in between critiquing my poses. Don't bend like that, it makes you look poor. That's my rich bitch. Daniel really didn't care that I was 12. He treated me like an adult and was way too sassy for my father to contend with. It was a professional photo shoot, and I felt like a star. When we paused so Daniel could change the lens on his camera, I was able to notice something swim under the ice beneath my skates. I thought it was a trick of depth, a shadow sliding under the ice, until it rose, and the darkness reshaped itself around a body. It was as long as a dolphin, and that's what I thought it was until it circled back and stopped right under me. I got down on my hands and knees to get a better look. I brushed away some of the frost, and what I saw was a bald woman with large black eyes and a wide triangle smile. It revealed rows of sharp teeth that she did her best not to present threatening. She put her hand up to the ice, and I could see her fingers were webbed together like a frog. Daniel wanders over to see what I'm staring at, and when he sees it, he gets all excited and starts taking pictures of it. My dad also dropped the lights to see what the commotion was all about. Daniel's rapid firing with his camera, running around the ice, following this creature as it swam small laps around our general area. I'll describe it as a mermaid, but only because that's the closest reference to an aquatic human that there is. But its body would more resemble the shape of a sea lion, rather than the conventional sleek human torsos conventional mermaids have. Its face, neck, and arms were the most human features it had, and possibly its intelligence, because I believe its actions were premeditated. Without the advantage of surprise, it's nearly impossible for humans to be outsmarted by any of the known creatures that reside in the animal kingdom. As for the creatures that reside outside of those gates, that's undetermined. I think Bigfoot would also fall into this undetermined category as well. If you believe in the existence of Bigfoot, you also had to come to the conclusion that they're a lot better at hiding than we are. I'd imagine these creatures we saw at the lake would have been even harder to document because aquatic creatures are a lot more elusive. Though I also don't know this. Maybe my story will inspire others to come forward without the fear of ridicule. So, Daniel's fully entranced by this thing swimming under the water. He keeps moving with it as it slowly leads him to where the ice was the thinnest. About 50 yards away from us on the lake, Daniel turns around, and the last thing he called over to us was, "No way, there's more of them over here." It was a bit louder than a whisper because of how far he'd walked. Then, Daniel wobbled, like he was thrown off balance. His legs slipped out from under him, but before his body could land on the ice, one of the creatures broke through the ice to take him. It became a feeding frenzy that ended as quickly and as viciously as it started. The splashing stopped, and the water was still again. My dad and I just sat there in a stunned disbelief. We counted 7 large dark shadows swimming under the ice back and forth in front of us. As they came closer, both of us scrambled to get off the ice. I still had my skates on, and I was able to get to the shoreline relatively fast. It was probably 10 feet from where we were, but at my dad's pace, it felt like 10 miles. My dad pushed me ahead of him as he did his best to run while maintaining his balance. It was like the ice began to sing long, hollow groans, and then long, deep cracks appeared and raced behind my dad toward the shoreline. He dove into the frozen gravel of the shoreline seconds before the ice shattered and separated on the lake. Getting back up to his feet, he tells me to run, but now I'm the one with the disadvantage because I still have my skates on. My dad turned around, picked me up, threw me over his shoulder. When he turned around for me, he looked past me and let out an uncontrollable gasp of fear before slinging me over his shoulder. When he turned back around to run, I was able to see what he gasped at. In the gravel where we'd just been, one of the creatures was crawling out of the lake, and I was able to see clearly its features. The torso was thick and tapered like a seal's, built for endurance rather than beauty. The skin, pale, hairless, stretched smooth and rubbery as wet stone. No scales or colors, just a cold, dead translucence that glistened in the setting sun. It had human structured shoulders, elbow, wrists, but elongated, the joints subtly over-articulated, the fingers webbed only at the base, long and dexterous, ending in blunt, darkened nails worn smooth by water and stone. The head was bald and rounded. The eyes were large, forward-facing, glassy and lidless. I could see our warped reflection in their solid black coloration. It didn't attempt to pursue us on land. It stayed on the shoreline and maintained eye contact with me, with careful intelligence, until we were far enough away that I couldn't see it anymore. My dad carried me the full way back to the truck, and he threw me into the passenger seat from the driver's side door. The large first-generation cell phone that we had in the truck didn't get any reception, so we drove to the first residence that we could find to use their phone. I stayed in the truck when my dad ran up and started pounding on the first house we saw. The owner answered the door with a shotgun pointed at my dad's chest. It scared the hell out of me, and for the second time in less than an hour, I had to accept that I might watch my dad die today. On the porch, however, he spoke quickly enough that I watched the homeowner put down his gun and gesture my dad inside. A few minutes later, he waves at me to come inside, and we waited there for an hour before the cops showed up. The old couple that owned the house were really sweet, and they had a big dog that I was able to pet for a little bit until the police arrived. When they did, and my dad was able to tell them what happened, he completely changed the series of events. I knew not to interrupt adults as they talked, but I was furious when he said that Daniel fell through the thin ice by accident, and I said no, the mermaids took him. The officer writing down the information looked at me, then back at my dad. He laughed and said, She's a little traumatized right now." The officer gave a polite chuckle and closed his notebook. I was so mad that he lied to the cops. I couldn't believe that he'd make me feel so silly about it. When we got in the truck and closed the doors, I told him how mean he was, how I'd never ever forgive him for not backing up the story. I felt betrayed by an adult cult that I hadn't been inducted into yet. After a moment of silence, my dad explained everything to me, and what he said gave me perspective that I hadn't considered. He goes, "You're mad at me right now? Are you fucking serious? Mermaids took him? If I told him that, you would have been in a foster home by the end of the day today. They would have been calling CPS immediately." He told the cops that the cameraman slipped into the water with heavy gear because it was something their brains could understand. He finished his rant with, "Jesus, Casey, if I just shook my head and agreed with my daughter saying it was mermaids, they probably would have taken me away for murder. That cameraman died in front of us. Daniel's dead, goddammit. And now you need to get into therapy. I need to get us therapists." I know his proactive plans negated any repressed memories I could have had in life. My therapist obviously didn't poo-poo my story when I told her, but she tried to rationalize it down to rogue seals, tails tipping the cameraman into the water. The actual person that I saw under the water could have also been, you guessed it, another seal, shaped weird from the thick ice. It took months, and it was politely explained, this should be the story that we stick with, or Dr. Rachel wouldn't be the only doctor I'd have to start visiting. Wink, wink. Meaning, take this ticket out, or let my pride send me directly to the loony bin, before strict regulations had been implemented in the mental health field. There's videos of the conditions of some of these facilities. They're on YouTube now. The footage is old and grainy, but when they showed it to me in my therapist's office, it was a new video that portrayed real, current environments, ones that I'd be sent to if I didn't stop. In the long run, red pill, blue pill, the details of how the story transpired wasn't the most important hill to die on, and its repercussions could have been much worse and led me down a life's path that I didn't need to be on. Though I've never been able to fully denounce my accounts to myself. They were never able to transform this into a false childhood memory, no matter how many sessions I'd attend. And in secret, I did my own research with the limited amount of resources I had. As one would guess, there's virtually no information on these things, but in my own logistics, I've been able to theorize that they most likely are not indigenous to the Great Lakes, and that the Gulf of St. Lawrence connects to the Atlantic. All this to say, the extent of my research is claiming that these things are from somewhere else and travel to the Great Lakes in a possible migration pattern. It doesn't really help me in figuring out what these things are, though. So, before I release my findings, I'm probably going to have to keep doing more digging. Consider this story one dig into the right direction. And so, if anyone in the Great Lakes area, or anyone anywhere, thinks that they know what I'm talking about, please get in contact with me. I'd really love to know before I die. About a decade ago, I took a short-term job offshore on an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico. I just finished a rough divorce and needed the money bad. I wasn't trained in drilling or anything. My role was mostly support, helping with cleanup, monitoring sensors, filling in whenever an extra set of hands was needed. The pay was good for 3 weeks of isolation and long shifts, and I figured I could handle anything for that long. The rig was called Nadir 6, sitting about 200 miles off the coast of Louisiana. It was older, built in the late 80s, but still in active rotation thanks to a patch of deep-sea reserves that they hadn't fully tapped. The guys there were mostly decent, some rough personalities, some loners, a couple of sarcastic lifers, but nothing too bad. But even from day one, Nadir 6 felt off. It started with the lights. At night from the platform you could see strange flickers below the surface, far too bright for fish, too slow and oddly rhythmic for anything mechanical. They weren't always in the same place. Sometimes they'd hover out near the edge of the visible water. Other times they'd be directly beneath the rig, pulsing, blue, green, and cold, like a heartbeat of light through murky glass. I asked about it the first night. One of the veteran guys, Roddy, he just muttered, "deep bioluminescence," and told me to ignore it. But then I caught two others talking in hushed tones about the same thing in the galley the next morning. One said the lights used to move. The other said that he saw them stop once, just stop, dead still. When he stared at it for too long, they just moved, like they were alive. But they always seemed to show up before something went wrong, is what one guy said. 3 days in, we did lose power to the lower pump station. The whole place shuddered, groaned. It was kind of creepy. Well, really creepy. One of the backup generators kicked on, but even then the hydraulics stayed out of sync. No explanation, just a blown fuse or an operator error, according to the report. 2 guys were reassigned to land shortly after. Didn't even say goodbye, just packed and left. A few nights later, a diver went missing. We were doing some inspection work on one of the main supports below the waterline. I wasn't on the dive team, but I helped monitor the audio and cam feeds. Everything looked fine until it didn't. 1 second, he's adjusting a valve. The next, there's a burst of static, and the screen goes black. Then you hear his muffled screams through the regulator. We all rushed to the control station. His voice, even though muffled, was in full panic. He kept trying to shout about lights in the dark, something moving between them. And then a noise, low, vibrating, not from his mic, like something scraping metal from the outside. His voice cut out and there was no bubbles or debris, no body, just silence. We pulled up the second diver, and he refused to speak, refused to even look at anyone in the eye. When he got to the surface, he ripped off his gear and sat shaking in the corner for hours. Management sent him home the next day on a private chopper. I never learned his name. We were told it was an equipment malfunction. No dive team was sent out again during my rotation, but those odd lights stayed. They changed, too. Not just pulsing anymore. They began circling, spinning around the rig, slow like a lazy orbit. It made the shadows move weird across the walls at night, especially the bunk halls. Like there were people walking past your door when there weren't. A guy named Sal swore that he saw one of those lights in his room, said it flickered just once, right above his head, and then vanished. He didn't sleep after that. Not once. They had to sedate him after he tried to climb the communications tower to get away from the glow. And just like so many others, he was gone by morning. I couldn't help but watch the lights every night, and I noticed something. They weren't just moving. They were forming shapes, geometric shapes, triangles, spirals, even writing. At least it looked like writing. Of course, I don't know what it said. Symbols I couldn't read, glowing and fading beneath the waves like phosphorescent calligraphy. I tried showing it to Roddy, but he refused to look with me. Said some things are better left alone. That night I woke up to silence, not calm ocean silence, the kind where everything stops. No creaks, no machinery, just stillness. Then the rig started humming. The sound came from below, vibrating through the floor like something massive had attached itself to the underside of the platform. Looking out, the lights beneath us flared, forming a perfect ring, and something rose. I didn't see all of it. No one did. just a glimpse, but it was enough. A wall of gray, featureless flesh, a slit of an eye the size of a manhole cover, rows of bioluminescent points crawling across the thing like veins. It wasn't a creature, not the way that we understand creatures. It was a presence, a depth-given form, something old and buried that had simply been waiting. We didn't even make it through the full 3 weeks. The rest of the crew, what was left of everyone, was evacuated the next morning under the guise of a mechanical failure. When we made it back, our gear was confiscated. Phones, journals. They made me confirm the video on my phone was the only copy I had, which it was. And they deleted it. They demolished the Nadir 6 that winter, said it was structurally unsound. I still have no idea if the ship was the problem, or something at sea. Maybe both. The two seemed to work in tandem together, and the more senior crew members, like Roddy, seemed all too familiar with what we encountered that trip. This is my Uncle Matt's story, and I for sure wouldn't have believed it if he didn't show me a scar on the back of his shoulder. It's covered by a big, cringy tribal tattoo with a Bible quote. It's barely visible, but I could see it when he pointed to it, moving his finger along an almost perfect circle of raised skin. Don't know why I shouldn't believe him, other than how extreme the story turned. I asked my dad the validity of his story. He's Matt's younger brother. He chuckled and said, "Oh yeah, looked him up for a while, that's for sure." So, story goes as follows. Matt got a job as a hydrographic surveyor right out of college. I don't really know the ins and outs of what a hydrographic surveyor does, besides basically using machinery on boats to map the seafloor. Depth, features, science stuff. Matt currently works at Amazon, pissing in jugs to meet delivery standards. I would have never guessed that he was a marine researcher in his past. He just never exactly came off as a scholar, not these days. Picture John Cleese, but homeless. Shaggy brown hair, gray beard. Throw on some glasses thicker than a bottle cap, and you've got my Uncle Matt. He was chosen to work with another scientist named Jason. Their job was to take a small boat with a bunch of machinery out into the English Channel, off the coast of London, where they would do their surveying work. Before they left port, the boat that they were supposed to use was having problems. Jason was acting as captain and lead of their expedition, and with his basic boating mechanics knowledge, he was able to get the motor running again and insisted that they set sail. Predictably, a malfunction would kill the power their first couple kilometers out to sea. While Jason tinkered with the engine below, Matt stays above on deck, leaned over the railing and watching the waves hit the side of the boat. 30 meters out, something floats to the surface that catches his eye, resembling a mound of rubbish or waste. The sun reflected off a big, glossy, black trash bag that laid over the rest of the stuff. Sadly, seeing trash in the ocean isn't a rare thing. Fishing nets mixed with other trash and sea life, it gets tangled all together until there's a buoy of discarded material and dead ocean creatures drifting in the waves. Although an unpleasant sight, it wasn't cause for alarm, according to Matt. It wasn't until he said that he saw a person under the tarp, and it looked like they were fighting the waves, trying to make it over to the boat. That's when he was alarmed. Doing a 360-degree scan, Matt couldn't figure out where this person came from. They were the only boat out there. He calls down to Jason, telling him what he sees, and soon they're both standing on the deck, watching this mass of trash slowly make its way to the boat. They debate if they should throw a flotation device as they stare at it, trying to get enough visual evidence that it's actually a human moving under there. The closer it gets, the figure struggling under the garbage bag begins to look undeniably like a human. As the waves bob the trash pile around, in between the mess, they see the upper body of a man, from his torso level up. Brief glimpses of flesh-tone arms frantically waving every time the black plastic bag moved in the water. It's clearly a human. He was struggling, and as strange as his appearance was, Jason and Matt both leapt into action. A floating ring was thrown from the boat. It was an accurate toss, landing meters from the man, but he didn't swim for it. As much as both of them screamed for the guy to go to the red and white ring, the black mass stayed on track toward the boat. The closer it got, the more unnatural the man began to look. Jason mentioned that the man keeps swinging his arms around like he's treading water. Matt waited for another wave to move the trash around and reveal the man again. When one was large enough to separate the other, Matt agreed with Jason's observation. For the distance he was covering while fighting against the current, it didn't look like he was swimming. He was in a constant state of drowning, emerging from the water, grasping out for anything to hold on to. Questions were traded amongst the two. If they could see the man's facial features, young, old, neither of them got a decent look at the man's face. A foreboding feeling spread between Matt and Jason as the drowning man neared his distance to the boat. They would keep shouting at the man until the giant plastic bag was rubbing against the side of the boat. It's close enough to the boat where they can't just look out from where they are and see it. One of them would actually have to walk to the edge of the boat and lean their body over the railing a bit in order to see straight down to the side of the boat. Jason, the appointed captain, without words, decided that he'd be the one to do it. So as Matt stayed on the middle of the deck, Jason walked to the side of the boat, and after taking a slow, deep breath, he put his hands on the railing and leaned over. The glossy, black trash bag that encompassed the floating blob looked more rubbery and thick than plastic. Parts of it were covered in barnacles. There was a visible nest of garbage, but a lot of what he saw wasn't definable. This is all stuff he was telling Matt as he looked over the side. The center of the mass was still rising and falling, like someone was stuck beneath it. Still thinking it was a man under there, Jason tells Matt to open the rear gate at the deck because he's going to drag it on board. Using a long, skinny metal rod, Jason pushed the blob to the rear of the boat and tells Matt to help pull the thing up. For its size, it's a relatively easy process for both of them to lift it out of the water and begin dragging this man on board. 2 arms reached out from under the muck, but they were thin, deformed. Jason keeps stepping backwards, trying to get it out of the water, as Matt stops and sees that whatever they're pulling onto the deck is still coming out of the water. It no longer looked like garbage coming out of the water. As Matt's trying to figure out what he's looking at, he hears Jason scream. He turns around, and the blob that they were pulling up has opened up. The flesh-toned person that they thought was trapped inside was in reality a group of tube-like tentacles that intricately twisted themselves to resemble a human figure. When untangled, there were over a dozen tentacles whipping around the boat as the creature began to pull itself on board. With half of its body still under the surface, Matt didn't know any marine animal that had those kinds of tentacles. They didn't have suction cups. They looked like hollow tubes, almost like big rubber garden hoses, but massive, and with rows of small, pointy teeth inside, each acting independently of each other. Seeing the chaos, Matt starts slamming the gate on the creature. But that only turned a few of the tube's attention away from Jason and onto him. They lunged towards him. He could feel the razor-sharp teeth embed themselves into his shoulder, and the creature began to drain his blood like a leech. Its slippery body nearly impossible to get a proper grip on, but with both hands, Matt is able to rip it off, leaving a circular hole in his shoulder where it latched onto him. He's still fighting with it when two more attach themselves to his hip and left thigh, striking with the same violent precision as the one that he'd already been wrestling with. It was overpowering, and the loss of blood would quickly weaken him until all he could do was lay there while the tentacles fed on him. Drifting in and out of consciousness, Matt could feel his body slowly being dragged toward the edge of the boat by one that was burrowed into his spine. Then, only by the grace of God, he hears a metallic grinding sound as the boat's motor comes back to life with a shake from under him, and the propellers started to spin in stuttered jolts. Its blades were chopping into what he had to believe was part of the creature, still submerged, because the tubes that were stuck into his body released, and Matt was momentarily smothered as he felt the weight of the other tentacles sliding over him, retreating into the ocean. The men were once again alone on the deck, and after a while, Matt gathered enough energy to pick himself up. Woozy from the loss of blood, he stumbles around the boat until he finds Jason slouched over the helm. His back was covered in bloody holes from the attack, but miraculously, he was still alive. Matt had to use all of his strength to move Jason's body over so that he could take the wheel. He recalls it as some of the worst stagnations of pain he's ever experienced while steering the boat back to land. The open wounds on his body stung like the creature injected toxins into him, and they also burrowed into muscles, severing tendons and making Matt scream out in pain when he has to steady the wheel against the waves. As the boat got into port, he used the radio, got in contact with someone who called an ambulance, and they were waiting when they arrived. The sedatives they gave Matt weren't effective, and he was awake the whole trip to the hospital. Doctors looked at him like he was mental when he had told them what happened. A male nurse overheard the story, suggested that it was a group of big eels or even prehistoric leeches. The nurse's comment may have been delivered in a facetious tone, but Matt argued vigorously, repeating that the tubes were too thin and were all coming from a single source that stayed hidden under the boat. He told them that they all started by presenting themselves in the shape of a human, all the tubes twisted to form a head, arms, down to its belt line. It was intentionally moving the way that it did. The doctor started writing on her clipboard. She didn't find it as humorous as the nurse did. But Matt knew right then and there that this hospital stay would probably be spent at the other kind of hospital, and he was right. But it was most likely in his best interest. Even after his lengthy stay there, my dad said that Matt became even more of a recluse than he already was, and I know it doesn't help that Jason would end up dying in the hospital a few days later, leaving Matt without anyone to validate his story. After I heard it and my dad confirmed it, he added, "Yeah, your Uncle Matt is a man who's lost his marbles, and it was a steep decline to where he is now. But he didn't always used to be like that." So I'm more inclined to believe what he's saying is true. I wanted to come on here, tell his story, and see if anyone with a marine background wanted to lend their ideas as to what this creature could have been. It may not uncrazy my uncle, but it might bring him a sense of closure. I don't know. You tell me. I'm afraid that it could also catapult him into some sort of frozen PTSD deadpan. He kept doing that in between his story, stopping all of a sudden with a 1,000-yard stare for a moment before starting again. Kind of freaked me out. In 2007, I spent a semester aboard the Nereus, a privately funded deep-sea research submarine designed to test new sonar mapping equipment and long-term humid submersion protocols. It was supposed to be the next big leap into ocean exploration, pressurized for extreme depths, outfitted with luxury bunking, and by a small team of hand-picked specialists. I was 23 and brought on as a communications intern, which really meant that I took notes and fetched coffee for the engineers. The plan was to spend 10 days submerged in the Puerto Rico Trench, mapping previously unexplored terrain. We descended slowly, testing equipment at intervals. The further we went, the quieter things got, until we passed 25,000 feet. That's when we noticed the sound. At first, it was a low-frequency hum, too deep to register on most of our instruments, but it made my molars buzz. We joked about it, said maybe the Earth was snoring, but it didn't stop. The deeper we went, the stronger it got. Some of the others started getting headaches. One of the sonar techs had a nosebleed. We should have turned around. Instead, over the next few days, we pushed deeper. By the 5th day, we hit the trench floor. A desolate, ink-black world filled with silt and shadow. We were beyond the reach of light. Even artificial lighting seemed to get swallowed by the darkness. And that's when the real weirdness started down there. Our equipment began picking up anomalies. Strange sonar returns shaped like spires, rising hundreds of feet from the ocean floor. But nothing was visible through the viewing ports, just blackness, and those vibrating noises that now came in pulses. It was like sonar in reverse. Not something we were sending out, but something that was scanning us. Captain Dupree tried brushing it off as geological activity, said gas pockets and crust shifts could explain the pulses, but by then, people were unraveling. One of the engineers started crying, refused to leave her bunk. Another guy kept whispering that he saw movement in the shadows outside the port glass. Huge shapes that didn't make noise, but left trails in the silt. On the 7th day, one of the external camera feeds started showing interference. At first, just static. Then flashes of something massive passing overhead. No one could agree on what it was. A fin, a spine, a set of glowing ridges. We slowed all operations. Everyone was on edge. That night, though night didn't really seem to mean much down there, I woke up to someone screaming. It was the comms officer, pounding on the sealed airlock hatch, begging to be let out. He kept saying that he heard someone calling his name from the ocean. He swore his mother was outside, just past the glass, telling him to open the hatch. They sedated him. The next morning, he was gone. No alarms, no breach, no alerts from the internal sensors. Just gone. As if he walked through the steel and left nothing behind, except for his uniform, which was folded on his bunk. We searched the whole vessel, and we found no one. Captain Dupree tried to contact Surface Command. Our signal couldn't get through. We were too deep, he said, and the solar flare activity might be affecting the satellite link. It felt like bullshit. And then we started hearing voices over the intercom, static-laced, garbled, but unmistakably human. The problem was, we weren't transmitting anything. Every voice that came through said the same phrase, "Not alone." It happened once every few hours, always the same line, always the same voice. None of us recognized it. On day 9, we began ascending, slowly, too slowly. Our ballast tanks weren't responding properly, and propulsion was limited. Something felt like it was holding us there. The pulses intensified, and so did the hallucinations. I woke up to find Dupree sitting in the control room with the floodlights pointed straight out into the void. He said if we just looked long enough, we'd understand. That's when I saw them. Hundreds of tiny reflections, like eyes, blinking in the dark. We reached 12,000 feet before we lost power. Completely. No lights, no engines. Just the emergency battery keeping life support running and emergency lights flickering. The walls of the sub started to creak. Something heavy was pushing against us from the outside. It didn't make sense. We were pressurized for depths even beyond this, but I swear the hull began to flex, like it was breathing, expanding and contracting in rhythm with the pulses. We drifted there for what felt like a full day. No one spoke. Most of us didn't sleep. I sat in the galley, holding a wrench I didn't know how to use in case something got in. Then, suddenly, power. Full system, lights back, motors engaged, cameras reset. But half the crew was gone. Vanished. No signs of damage, no breaches. Just bunks with impressions in the sheets. The sonar was clear. Nothing nearby. Just a clean, flat trench and miles of empty water. Panic ensued with the remainder of us. And when we lost the power again, I wasn't sure I was going to make it. I thought, that's the end. I'm gonna just disappear, vanish. But when the power returned, moments later, everyone was back. The crew entirely intact. When those of us that had remained asked the missing where they'd gone, they had no idea what we were talking about. To them, they'd been there the entire time. We surfaced 16 hours later. Coast Guard met us, took statements, ran tests. We weren't allowed to speak to each other after that. They split us up, NDA'd the hell out of everyone. The official story is that we experienced carbon dioxide exposure and had severe shared hallucinations. That the missing crew had never indeed been lost, but were due to internal psychotic episodes, and they had staged their own exits, somehow, deep underwater, without triggering an alarm. And then returned, also without triggering an alarm. Honestly, I don't know what the hell happened down there, so I was technically happy to sign an NDA. I never wanted to really talk about it again. I guess not until now. Seems kind of far-fetched to even ask if anyone's had an experience like this, but I am curious. What have you experienced 10,000 feet and below? I graduated from high school in 2001, and my best friend at the time happened to be stupid rich. For her graduation present, her dad wanted to take us on a 2-month-long deep-sea voyage. They called the boat a yacht. I'm not sure if it really was a yacht or just a big-ass fancy boat. Don was the only rich friend I ever had, and I'm quite poor. I just know that this was smaller than the insanely huge yachts I see on TV. Still, it was big enough for us, her dad, a cook, a butler, and a few sailors to live on comfortably. So yeah, that's probably a yacht. Anyway, we set sail out of Fort Lauderdale. We were supposed to visit the Bahamas and all those little island places. But Dawn decided that she wanted to see Morocco for some impulsive reason I can't remember. Her dad was one of those guys that thought buying a boat magically made you an expert sailor. But he was a terrible captain. On several occasions, we heard him arguing with the crew, the guys who actually did this stuff for a living, about going off course, but no, he knew better. So there we were, almost 3 weeks through our trip, somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, and a terrible storm hits. If you've never experienced a storm at sea, consider yourself lucky. It's absolutely miserable. Dawn and I stayed in our cabin, but we couldn't help but look out the little windows. I got sick multiple times, while she cried about being too pretty to die. The butler stayed with us, but he didn't know what he was doing any more than Dawn's dad. He was just there to clean up after us. At one point, we hit a wave so high that the boat went almost a full 90 degrees, and I thought that was going to be game over. When we went horizontal again, it sounded like the boat was breaking apart. I'm surprised it didn't. I truly can't describe how awful it was. It felt like it would never end, but it finally did, and we were mostly in one piece. There was some damage to the deck itself, and a large section of the railing had been crushed. Parts were torn away completely, while other parts were just flattened and mangled. Dawn and I were told to stay away from that area until we could find a port. Needless to say, we weren't going to Morocco anymore. It would take the rest of our trip just to get the repairs done and make it home on time. I had no problem staying off the damaged part of the deck. I didn't even want to leave our cabin at that point. I'd had quite enough of the sea. Dawn, however, was still living her spoiled rich girl fantasy of invincibility. Despite how she screamed when we were actively in danger. She decided that she needed pictures of all the damage to show our friends back home. She said no one would believe how bad the storm had been if we didn't have photographic evidence, and heaven forbid she miss out on any of the attention it would bring her. You're probably starting to understand why we aren't friends anymore, but hold on, it gets worse. So Dawn drags me onto the deck and starts posing next to the missing section of the railing. I had to take the pictures, of course. We were using one of those cheap disposable cameras because her dad didn't trust her with the good camera. Smart man on that front. After we snapped a few pictures, Dawn looked down into the water and started freaking out, yelling for me to give her the camera. I did, and looked over to see a massive, dark shadow rising to the surface. I really thought that it was a whale. We both did. Nothing else could be that huge, right? Dawn laid flat on the deck and leaned over the edge, snapping away as it got closer to the surface. Then the butler saw us, and I feel bad that I can't remember that man's name. He ran over, yelling for us to back up. I did, just out of reflex, but Dawn was totally engrossed in getting her pictures. The butler grabbed her just as the shadow broke the surface. He pulled her backwards just as the waves violently rocked the boat and sent the poor man and our camera flying into the water. Dawn and I both screamed and rushed to the edge in time to see not a whale, but a shark. A massive shark. It wasn't a great white. Those are big, but not whale size. And they sure can't swallow a man whole. But that's exactly what happened here. I know they're supposed to be extinct, but I swear to God, we watched a megalodon shark surge through the water and swallow the butler whole. Each of its teeth were bigger than our heads. The butler was there 1 second and gone the next with the shark. As it dove back underwater, its tail hit the boat and almost sent me and Dawn into the water too. The only thing that saved us were the sailor guys. They grabbed us and threw us away from the edge, hard. I'm not complaining. I'm extremely grateful, don't get me wrong. Dawn's dad appeared right after, and all of the sailors started talking to each other in Spanish. I have no idea what they were saying, but it looked like they were arguing. Dawn's dad was furious. He sent us back to the cabin, where we were made to wait there for hours. When he came down to talk to us, he didn't want to hear about the megalodon. He told us that the butler lost his balance and fell into the water, that it was a tragic accident, and despite the crew's best efforts, he was lost at sea. His family was later given a large settlement to leave it at that, and we went along with the story. We didn't have any proof to say otherwise, so why bother? When we finally made it back to a dock, the boat was sold as is, and Dawn's dad got us plane tickets home. I haven't gone back to the ocean since then. On the rare occasions I can afford a vacation, I prefer to stay landbound. I've never told this story before because I don't have the actual footage anymore. And you know what they say, no pics, didn't happen. But I'm honestly tired of just keeping it to myself, and I don't mind too much if strangers on the internet call me crazy, so here goes. I turned 17 last summer, and my parents took me and my cousins to California. We went to a bunch of places, but one of the things we did was deep sea fishing. I'm not much of a fisherman myself. That part was my dad and cousin, but I was excited to go because one of my presents was an underwater drone, and I couldn't wait to try it out. I wanted to get some cool shots of the fish getting caught, but it turns out the fish didn't want to bite while the drone was moving around, so I had to film from the other side of the boat. Also, my drone had a 15-meter range, which is just short of 50 feet. I had to be careful not to go deeper than that. It's noteworthy that my dad and cousin started fishing below 100 feet, when I couldn't film anyway. But they still blamed me when they couldn't catch anything. That was fine. No one was pooping on my party except for me. I recorded a lot of beautiful fish and took the drone to its absolute limit in every direction. It's really hard to describe what happened, so bear with me while I try to paint the scene. My drone had a good light on it, so I could see pretty well. But beyond the light, it was just kind of dark abyss, especially when looking down. Eventually, I saw 2 glowing lights right below me, but they were deeper than the drone could go. I'm as far from a marine life expert as you can get. My interests lay more in filming and editing, and this was just a new way to do that. I probably know less about the ocean than most of you listening to this, but I did know that some fish have glowing eyes, and I know about those fish with the little dangling lights on their heads. These 2 lights were pretty far apart, so they couldn't have been eyes. I thought I must be seeing 2 of those cool dangling flashlight fish. I wanted to get a shot of them so badly. It would have been the coolest part of my movie. I pushed the drone to its limits trying to get a glimpse, but they were just too deep to make out any of their features. They weren't moving, so I didn't either. I hoped they would just come closer to my light or just move closer to each other if the drone was stationary for a few minutes. Eventually, that seemed to work. The lights did seem to get closer, even though I couldn't see any actual movement happening. I started to wonder if I was imagining it, because it seemed weird that they would move that slow and in sync with each other. But hey, maybe that's how these kinds of fish worked, for all I knew. After a few more minutes, I could tell that they were definitely getting closer. The lights were bigger, brighter, and I could almost see the shapes behind them. Only it looked wrong. Instead of 2 separate shapes, it was one giant shape. I thought maybe they were bigger than I realized and coming up side by side, but that wasn't right either. The overall mass extended too far in each direction. Finally, they were close enough to be sure that those weren't the cool flashlight fish. They were eyes, after all. 2 small eyes on a massive body that stretched too far to see the end of. I looked away for half a second to call my mom over. When I looked back, the glowing eyes were surging towards my drone. I had enough time to see a giant mouth filled with rows of needle teeth devouring my drone, and then the screen cut out. I tried to explain what happened, but my mom thought that I went too deep and it sunk out of range. She was pissed. So was my dad. But I was too freaked out to care. In the middle of our argument, something hit the bottom of the boat, hard enough to violently rock it. It wasn't a small boat either. This thing was a pretty good size. The captain didn't have a clue what could have caused it, but he seemed just as scared as I was and said that we had to leave early. I stayed in the middle of the boat with my parents, but my cousin ran to look over the side. The boat got hit a second time just as we started moving, and he almost went overboard, but managed to hang on. He swears he saw a dinosaur-sized tail sinking back below the surface as we sailed away. My parents were more afraid than angry, right up until we made it back to the dock. Then they decided it was probably just a whale and that I was careless with my drone. I tried to pull up the footage on the app to show them that it couldn't have been a whale, but the video wouldn't play. It was corrupted data. I don't understand how that's even possible. Whales don't have glowing eyes or multiple rows of needle teeth, but even if they did, why would that affect my recording? Why would anything affect the recording? My cousin said that the tail he saw was pointed at the end, not finned like a whale's, but they thought that he was trying to cover for me. I've never seen him so freaked out, though. I knew he wasn't lying. He still swears to exactly what he saw, and I know what I saw. The ocean is no place to fuck around and find out. I was on a ferry for a school softball trip off Kodiak Island in Alaska, 2014. I was 18. A whole bunch of us had snuck up to the deck around 11 p.m., wanted to watch the waves and smoke cigarettes and weed and just be general teenagers on a boat without supervision. It was 11 p.m. in May in Alaska, so the sun was thinking about setting, but it was still bright outside. So we're just doing our thing and we notice a pod of orcas swimming with the ferry's wake, which is very cool but not, unusual. If you're familiar with the dimensions of an orca's fin, you know that they're about 4 to 6 feet in height and look like big black spikes coming out of the water. They travel and hunt in pods of anywhere between 15 to 40 whales, apex predators, the beautiful demon murderers of the sea, total assholes, but top of the food chain. So, we saw a pod of orcas, counted them to be about 10 or 15, with some babies scattered in there. Very fun to watch. Took them a good 30 minutes to all go by. We tried to get pictures, but it was just dark enough that our shitty phone cameras weren't much good. And about 30 or 40 minutes go by, we've pretty much sobered up and it's about to get dark. We're cold and sleepy and about ready to go in. No more orcas. Haven't seen one for like a half an hour. And then one of my JV girls spots another one. So we all turn and look, but one dorsal fin is immediately followed by another, and another, and another, and then two more after that, in separate rows, and they're taller by a lot, and jagged, like some would have whole chunks torn out of them. And they were 8, maybe 10 feet tall, and they were all attached to one creature. We could barely see its back slicing through the water, covered in these rows of spikes, and it just keeps coming. This thing is like 20 or 30 feet from the ferry, running parallel to it, and we're all just transfixed. Like there's 9 or 10 of us, no one's saying a word because we've all just turned to look at a whale, and we're all now watching something that's like horrifyingly, terrifyingly, obviously not a whale. Someone tries to take a picture, but it's too dark at this point, and the only reason we can see this thing is the light that's cast from the ferry portholes. Tale as old as time, when it comes to things you really fucking wish that you had a picture of. But we all stand there, completely scared and fucking stiff, in awe. We watch this thing just keep surfacing for a good 6 or 7 minutes, which means that whatever it was long. Like 60 or 70 feet long, or longer, and covered in enormous spikes. Spikes that looked like they'd won 1,000 battles with God knows what. It took what felt like an eternity for any of us to say anything after the last of it disappeared into the strait. I mean, if you and 8 of your friends had just seen something that all science had definitely pointed to not existing, and you had all seen the exact same thing, and it was very obviously trailing, no, probably hunting, not one, but 15 apex predators. What do you even say to break the silence? That's the thing that eats me about this whole thing. It was the hunting. It was following them. It was literally hunting about 60 ton of toothy, angry, intelligent apex predator. Every once in a while, one of us will hit another one of us up and check in, like, hey, do you remember this? Was I hallucinating? Did we all see the same insane, worldview melting, terrifying thing that night? And the reason I know we did is because none of us talked about it after that. Not during the trip. Not after. Not to any of our friends, because we knew how the fuck do you even tell someone about that? But now, almost 10 years between us and that night, I assume that some of them probably have told other people. I know that I tell people, because I've seen a lot of shit like that in Alaska. And also because there's a very rich history among Native Alaskans of a something that lives and hunts in the waters around Kodiak. And it's important to tell its story because someday it's going to eat a little too much plastic. And no one's ever going to watch it hunt a pod of orcas from a boat ever again. My dad was a sonar tech in the Navy for 15 years and spent a lot of his time on submarines, specifically testing the new ones. He told me many stories from his time at sea, but he never revealed why he quit the Navy until I was in my mid-20s. His crew had been assigned to test a new model, built to go in deeper waters for longer periods. When they reached their target depth, they began running the next round of tests, and the sonar detected a large range of hills along the seafloor. It had a giant round mound over 200 feet high, with several small ridgelines stretching out of its center. My dad described it as if someone had taken a giant octopus and laid it with its legs splayed outwards. The following day, they continued along their route and made it to the next checkpoint for mapping in the various tests. Only this time, there was a problem with the results. The octopus-like mass was closer than it should have been, and some of its legs were at the wrong angle. It seemed their navigation had somehow taken them off course, so everything had to stop while they figured out what was wrong and how to fix it. They spent the entire day checking every part of their systems, but they couldn't find the error. In addition, everything else on the sonar was exactly where it should be. So how was this mini mountain range in a new position, like it had followed them? After another round of tests and checks yielded the same results, they received orders to proceed to the next checkpoint. There, it was the same story. Everything seemed to work perfectly, except the sonar showed the mass as being the same distance from them as the previous days, and the legs were once again in new positions. All of the data was reading as if those hills were actually following them along the ocean floor, like they were alive. Every crew member was an experienced sailor. They all had heard stories about prehistoric creatures still living in the sea. Some of the men were starting to think the landmass was actually one of those monsters, that its shape wasn't a coincidence. They held their position overnight, but there were no further changes in the seascape. Being unable to determine the equipment's malfunction or quell the rising panic amongst the crew, they were ultimately ordered to abort the mission and begin their ascent. They had only risen a few hundred feet when the sonar showed one of those legs moving towards them. Whatever that mass happened to be, it was alive. It wasn't moving fast. Whether it didn't feel the need to or simply couldn't is unknown. But the long appendages dwarfed the submarine. It would be all too simple to crush them beneath its colossal weight. With no time to spare, the captain gave the order to fire or torpedo and increase to full speed. The creature took a hit and let out a sound that haunted my father until the day he died. He couldn't describe it except to say that it felt like the ocean itself was crying in pain. Every man on the sub froze as a shockwave from the explosion carried them helplessly away. The sonar was rendered useless during this time. At first, they believed it was damaged in the blast, but once the creature fell silent, it began to function normally once again. 2 days later, the Navy sent 2 teams down in hopes of eliminating the creature and recovering its body for study. But after more than 3 weeks of searching, there was simply no sign of it. My dad, along with most of his crewmates, never felt safe in the water again. Several were discharged, but my father managed to finish the last months of his contract. He had always planned to stay in the Navy until he retired, but thanks to this experience, he decided to sell cars instead. It was a huge change to our lifestyle, but I was just a kid who missed her dad. I thought he wanted more time at home, and for years afterwards, he never let us see the trauma beneath the surface. That's just the kind of man he was. Then, last year, he passed away after a long battle with cancer, and I've been thinking about his old stories a lot. So, I thought it might be good to share this one. If you spend a lot of time out at sea, please stay safe. There's so much we still don't know about the ocean. I've never told anyone this in full. My wife knows something weird happened, but I've never gone into detail because honestly, I don't think anyone would believe me. I'd prefer to stay anonymous, but I just keep thinking about it over and over, so here goes. This happened about 6 years ago off the coast of North Carolina. I was scuba diving with 2 friends on a wreck that we'd been planning to explore for a while. An old World War II freighter sitting about 90 feet down. Visibility was okay, current wasn't bad. I was the first one down. I should mention that I've been diving for about 15 years. I know my limits. I'm careful with air, depth, decompression. This wasn't my first time diving wrecks either. About 20 minutes into the dive, I broke off slightly from the group to check out a passage under a collapsed portion of the hull. My buddies were nearby, maybe 15 feet off, clearly visible. I saw what looked like an old ladder descending into the sand, half buried. I went down to inspect it, and that's when something changed. The water, it felt thicker, and the temperature, it had dropped, but only around me. It got dark fast. Visibility went from 15 feet to maybe 5 in seconds. It was like a fog bank had rolled in underwater. My dive light started flickering. At first, I thought that it was dying, but I'd just changed the batteries that morning, and that's when I noticed something else. This sound, like a vibration, not mechanical, and not marine life. It was low and rhythmic, almost like breathing. Not mine, something big. I turned to signal my buddies, but I couldn't see them anymore. Nothing but cloudy water. I checked my gauges and everything looked fine. I wasn't low on air. I wasn't panicking. Not yet. And then I felt a hand. It closed around my upper arm, firm, cold, and unmistakably human. It wasn't a snag. It wasn't gear. This was a hand. But there was no one there. I spun around fast. My heart was pounding as I did. I was expecting to see one of my friends screwing with me, but no one was there. Just emptiness. My light steadied for a second, and I swear to God, just beyond the beam, I saw a face. Pale, eyes open, but blank. Air floating upward like seaweed, and then it was gone. I was sort of frozen in place. I didn't know which way was up anymore. My mask fogged slightly, and I realized that I'd started breathing too fast. I forced myself to calm down and check my compass. I turned toward where I thought the wreck was, but it was like the ocean had swallowed it whole. I was just gone, from everything. And that's when it got worse. My regulator suddenly stopped pulling air. Not a full failure, just a sudden resistance, like something had clamped down on the flow. My tank had plenty of PSI. I tapped the gauge, nothing. I tried my backup, same thing. In that moment, I was 90 feet underwater, alone, disoriented, and couldn't breathe. Then I felt another touch, this time on my back, not grabbing, pushing, firm and steady. I started rising slowly at first, then faster than I wanted. I should have been inflating my BCD, but I hadn't touched it. My hands weren't even on the controls. Whatever was pushing me, it was guiding me up. I could feel fingers between my shoulder blades. It didn't feel aggressive, just urgent. I broke the surface, gasping, ripping my mask off and coughing. I was almost 100 feet from the dive boat. My friends surfaced about 5 minutes later, panicked. They'd lost sight of me and had been circling the wreck looking for any sign of me. I asked if either of them had grabbed me or seen anyone else down there. They hadn't. I didn't tell them about the hand or the face, not then. Later, when I logged the dive, I checked my depth profile. There was a strange anomaly. My depth jumped erratically for a few seconds before I started ascending, like I'd been lifted. I kept thinking about the face, the hand, the way it felt so deliberate. I even did some digging into the wreck, and it turns out that the ship had gone down in 43 after taking a torpedo. Most of the crew made it off, but 3 were listed as missing, never recovered. Divers say it's one of the more active wrecks, but most people just chalk it up to eerie feelings or cold spots. I know what I felt. Someone or something down there, and it didn't want me to die. Make of that what you will. When I was growing up, my mom would take me and my sister sailing on most weekends. The tradition started a few months after my dad died. I guess it was her way of trying to take our mind off of things, and the habit just kind of stuck. Sometimes we would spend a night out at sea. We all loved to watch the sunset and rise over the open water. For really nice nights, we would make our beds on the deck and watch the shooting stars while we fell asleep. On one of those nights, we all woke up to a high-pitched whirring noise and a big, swirling, flashing light shooting out of the sky. It came down so fast. 1 second it was in the sky, and then it was crashing into the ocean, maybe 100 yards from us. It hit so hard that the waves nearly knocked our boat over, and we got soaked by the overflow. When we looked over at where the lights went down, there was an object, almost as big as our boat, floating in the ocean. It was glowing, but with a softer light than what had shot across the sky. I don't know what to call its shape. It had at least 4 sides just from what we could see, so maybe octagonal once you included the other side. It rose into 4 tall peaks, and each one had dark window-like panes circling around the top. My sister and I were more fascinated than afraid. I was only 11, she was 9, so we didn't really understand what was happening, or what could have happened. But our mom was terrified, even though she didn't show it. Over the years, she only spoke of this incident a handful of times, but when she did, she described it as the worst night of her life. Her first instinct was to get us the hell out of there, but she was afraid of drawing attention to us. Ultimately, she couldn't be sure if she decided it was best to stay still, or if she was just frozen with fear. Then one of the spires opened up, and 3 blinding white spherical shapes emerged and started circling what I'm just going to call the UFO, because what the hell else do you call this thing? They would stop at certain points like they were interacting with it, likely making repairs from what we could see or theorize. After a few minutes of this, they went back inside. I'm not sure if they didn't notice us or didn't care that we were there, but as soon as the top closed, the UFO lit up super bright again, like when it was in the sky, and it shot straight up. It was so fast, it looked like a shooting star as it disappeared back among the stars and out of sight. My sister and I thought that we saw a magic show. We were so excited, we didn't understand why our mom stayed up the rest of the night, or why she made us leave at the crack of dawn. We do now, obviously. We still went sailing a lot after that, but we never went out quite that far again. My great-uncle swore he saw Viking longships in the North Sea during a storm. He never backed down from his story. It might sound a little far-fetched, but it's a story I grew up hearing from someone I trusted more than almost anyone else. My great-uncle, my granddad's older brother, spent most of his life in the Navy. He was one of those old-school sailors, hard jawline, rolled sleeves, voice like gravel. He wasn't the superstitious type, didn't believe in ghosts or aliens. If it wasn't something you could punch or swear at, it didn't concern him. But he told me this one story, only once, when I was around 11. It was retold to me by others, but he told me once, and I still think about it to this day. He was stationed somewhere in the North Sea. I don't remember the exact coordinates, but it was cold, bleak, and deep into the winter. Said that they were on patrol during a bad stretch of weather. Not a hurricane, but close enough. Gray skies, heavy winds, waves that made the deck feel like a seesaw from hell. He and a few of the guys were on deck duty that night, all of them roped in because of how violent the water was. Everyone soaked to the bone, goggles nearly useless with all the salt and spray. Visibility was awful, and most of the guys were just trying to get through the shift without puking or freezing. And that's when he saw them. He said it like this. We were riding a swell. The ship tilted up, and I swear on my mother's grave, we saw longships. Viking longships. 12 of them. Wooden, blackened by the rain. Carvings on the front, snakes and dragons or the like, just rising out of the water. Oars cutting through the sea in unison. He said they weren't lit. No lights, no motors, no sound but the storm. Just perfect silhouettes moving through the rain and darkness. Steady, like they weren't even affected by the storm, like they belonged there. One of the guys next to him saw it too and yelled, "What the hell is that?" But by the time the others turned, the wave dropped, and they lost sight of everything. Just black ocean again. He told the others, told the higher-ups too, and he got mocked for it. Guys joked about him needing glasses, about drinking too much, about ghosts of angry Norsemen coming to collect unpaid debts. You name it. But he never backed down. Not once. He didn't even tell the story that often, only a few times from what I'm told, and almost always after someone else brought it up. But every time he did, his eyes went distant. He'd lean forward a little, lower his voice and say, "They were real. I wasn't hallucinating. I didn't hit my head. I saw them." I believed him. It wasn't just that he was family. He didn't really do ghost stories. I'd heard plenty of his sea tales about engines dying in the middle of nowhere, about lightning striking so close it fried a guy's radio pack. But this was the only one that ever felt different, like it haunted him, just a little. Years later, I asked him about it again. He was probably in his late 70s by then, mostly retired from storytelling. I was in college, studying Norse mythology of all things, and I wanted to hear it from him directly one more time. He chuckled when I brought it up and said, "Still thinking about those boats, huh?" And then he paused and looked out the window for a long time. There was no joke or punchline. He just said, "There are things out on the water older than you and me, older than steam or steel." Maybe they don't show themselves unless they want to. Maybe they never left. That was the last time we talked about it. He never did retell the story, but he passed away 2 years later. I still think about that night, what he saw, how sure he was. I choose to believe him, not because it's fun, but because he never asked anyone else to. This happened about 5 years ago, and to this day, I still can't look at deep water the same. I was kayaking solo on a glacial-fed river in Montana. Stupid in hindsight, but the current was moving faster than I expected. I'd done the stretch before. I figured I could handle it. Somewhere around the third bend, I hit a submerged log. It's one that was sitting just beneath the surface. No warning, no splash, just boom. The kayak instantly flipped. I remember the freezing shock of the water. It hit me first, like knives in my lungs. And then the world went dark. I was trapped, upside down. I was pinned under the damn thing. My paddle was gone, one arm stuck between the cockpit rim and my body, the other flailing. I had maybe 5 inches of air trapped inside with me, just enough to panic in. I was thrashing harder than I ever have, but the current was pressing the boat down. I wasn't just flipped. It was wedged against the log underwater, and I was still in it. I don't know how long I was under, maybe 30, 90 seconds, long enough for my brain to scream every terrible thing it could come up with. That I was going to drown, that no one would find me until I floated downstream, that my parents would never know what happened. The cold started making its way in, and I could feel my fingers going numb. That scared me more than anything, because when your hands stop working, you just stop fighting. And then, a miracle. The current shifted just slightly, a tug, like someone pulling my foot. Literally, someone was pulling me out of the kayak. I felt myself reach fresh air and took a breath. I flipped the kayak back over, held on for dear life, and looked to thank my savior. No one was there. I don't know how. I replayed it 1,000 times. I still don't understand how I got out. I surfaced maybe 20 feet downstream. I was coughing up water, shaking. I couldn't really swim anymore. I just sort of floated there, just holding on until I could drag myself out. I got lucky, really lucky. Mild hypothermia, a bruised rib, lost a lot of my gear, but I lived. Now I don't ever go out alone. I use a dry suit in cold water. I strap a knife to my chest. I respect the hell out of rivers because they can silence you. My grandpa spent his life on fishing boats in the North Sea, and he passed down a lot of stories before his stroke in 2016. Most of them involved giant waves, sinking ships, or piracy. But there was one instance he only spoke of a few times. If you aren't familiar with the North Sea, it's among the most dangerous bodies of water in the world. Grandpa worked on one of the larger boats, but even the biggest get tossed around like toys. Severe storms appear suddenly and unpredictably. The waves were so violent that the men were thrown about the ship without warning. Broken bones and concussions were just routine hazards of the job. Of course, that was nothing compared to falling overboard. That's why any man walking on the deck was tethered to a safety line. The day in question was one of the rare brighter days, but those came with their own dangers. Pirates were far more active on those occasions. Grandpa was one of the men posted to keep watch, while the others brought in the nets. These giant nets were lifted with a crane and capable of supporting more than 1,000 pounds, so we're talking durable stuff here. But this time, it only rose a few feet before coming to a grinding halt. Grandpa had a better view from his position, but even he could only see the line disappearing beneath the surface. The crane was under too much strain and quickly switched off, but the awful grinding noise didn't stop. Next, the line suddenly went slack. The net was rising again, but only for a second. It then went tight with great force and seemed to be pulled out to sea. The ship was dragged behind it for a short distance before the line fell slack again. While most of the crew were distracted with bringing in the net, my grandpa and 2 others were still watching the water. They saw a giant ripple appear. It was more than 3 times the length of the boat as something began rising to the surface. Grandpa thought that he was about to see some kind of military submarine, but instead, it was a fishtail, half the size of a blue whale. Not that you typically see blue whales in the North Sea, but it's supposed to be the largest creature in the world. Yet here was something that had an equally as large of a tail, possibly bigger. Only the finned part emerged, and it quickly disappeared again with a hard slap that sent a dangerous wave crashing into the side of the ship. You never want a wave to hit you from the side. They're lucky it didn't take them down, but it did knock Grandpa from his post. If not for the safety line, I would have probably never been born. When order was finally restored, the empty net was pulled back onto the boat. Something had ripped it apart. The ends hadn't been cut or chewed through. They had been pulled apart by brute force. Men who spend their lives at sea tend to be a superstitious bunch, and these guys were no different. By the time they learned what Grandpa and the other 2 witnessed, they were all ready to sail back to port, even though they had 3 weeks left on the hitch. I guess a lot of people would find a new profession, but there weren't a lot of job opportunities in my family's area, so my grandfather spent another 30 years at sea before finally retiring. It was a common lifestyle where they were from. My dad moved to the U.S. for college, where he met my mother, and we've been in Illinois ever since. I don't put much stock into ghosts or monsters, but we don't know what the hell might be out there in the oceans. I don't play when it comes to that stuff. I camp with the same group of friends every year. Just a guy's trip to unplug, fish, drink too much, and talk crap around the fire. We never go to the same spot twice, and last fall we picked a site near a creek in the Tennessee backwoods. Beautiful place, crystal clear water, moss-covered rocks, and not another soul for miles. The first night, normal stuff. We set up camp, cooked dinner. Someone fell asleep in a camp chair holding a beer. You know the drill. But the second night, we stayed up late, talking. Around midnight, one of the guys, Kevin, noticed something across the creek. "Who's that?" he asked, squinting. We all looked, but just trees, far as I could tell. But Kevin swore he saw someone, a man standing knee-deep in the water. He said that he thought it was a fisherman at first, but something about the way he stood wasn't right. Too still, like he was waiting for something. We chalked it up to moonlight and beer, but Kevin wouldn't let it go. He didn't sleep that night, just sat by the fire with his flashlight aimed at the creek. The next morning, we found wet footprints around the back of Kevin's tent. Just his tent. He left after that. Said something didn't feel right. I can't blame him. The rest of us stayed the final night, but nobody slept well. The creek, which had been peaceful before, suddenly felt too quiet, in a creepy way. Whatever Kevin saw, if he saw anything at all, it certainly left a mark on him. He doesn't camp with us anymore. Says he's done with the woods. Says the man in the creek might still be watching. Seems a little dramatic, but he's serious. This happened about 10 years ago, off the coast of Nova Scotia. I was working on a private salvage crew. Small contracts, old wrecks, and lost cargo. We weren't pirates, but we weren't exactly the Coast Guard either. It was early spring. The water was still cold enough to bite through your bones. We were out scanning an area known for ship debris when we caught something unusual. An object sitting still on the sonar, barely 40 feet down. It looked like a small trawler, steel hull, no markings, just sitting there, not sunken into the sand, not covered in growth, like it had just arrived. We almost didn't dive. The conditions were iffy, and we'd gotten nothing on the manifest to indicate that a wreck was fresh. But money was money, so down we went. I was the first in. My partner, Ray, followed about 5 minutes later. Visibility was better than expected. Cold, but clear. And there it was. A boat. A boat. Upright. Intact. No drag marks, no damage. Completely preserved. We swam closer, circled the stern, and there were no ID numbers, no nets, no rust. There was a name painted in crisp white on the side. Starling. It looked new. Not totally new, but not barnacled either. The ladder on the port side was hanging down into the water like someone had just used it. I radioed Ray to document everything. He didn't respond. He floated beside me, masked turned toward the boat, not moving. Ray? He tilted his head, like he was hearing something that I wasn't. And then he swam to the ladder. I grabbed his fin to stop him, but he jerked free, twisting to face me. His eyes were wide, but there was no fear in them, just this weird calm. He shook his head at me, slow, like, don't. I pulled him back anyway, fought him until he finally gave in and we both surfaced. On the deck, I asked what the hell he was doing. He looked me dead in the eyes and said, I saw someone on board. I thought I did. We marked the coordinates, got back to base, and filed our logs. The next day, the boat was gone. We returned to the spot with better equipment, searched for hours. Nada. No evidence anything had ever been there. In December, my area in Texas experienced some serious floodwaters. I know several people who lost their lives or came close to it. The floodwaters hit quickly, and to say that we aren't built for that is a bit of an understatement. My family did fine. We weren't out on the roads, which seemed to be the most dangerous place to be. Some damage to the outside of our house, some trees nearby caused some issues for a few days, but that was the worst of it. But it wasn't the weirdest of it. I can't explain what happened the morning after the worst of the floods, but I'm going to try to relay it. We were sort of trapped in our neighborhood for a couple of days due to downed trees and a flooded road. So during that time, we just went around with our other neighbors helping anyone who needed it. The second morning, the water had mostly receded, leaving behind the kind of mud that sucks your boots in when you try to walk. My husband and I were making rounds with 2 other neighbors when we reached the last row of houses on the far side of the loop, a stretch of homes that backed up against the thick of the woods. One of the houses there had been hit especially hard. Debris clung to the front fence, and the windows on the lower floor were blown out. And that's when we heard it. Help. It was faint but urgent, a voice definitely human, crying out from inside the house. We all froze, and then it came again. Help. Clearer this time. Multiple voices maybe, begging, pleading. My stomach dropped. The 4 of us rushed to the door and tried it, but it was swollen shut from the water. My neighbor Tim kicked it in, and we charged inside expecting to find people trapped or hurt. But there was no one. The house was completely empty. Furniture overturned, water lines creeping up the walls, mud smeared across the floor, but no signs of life. We split up, calling out, checking closets and the upstairs rooms. Nothing. The house was dead quiet, and yet we all swore that we heard it. Not just me, all of us. Same direction, same voices. We regrouped in the living room, rattled and confused. Tim made a sort of nervous joke about sound bouncing in weird ways after a flood, but none of us really believed it. Not the way that voice had sounded so close, so desperate. I still think about that morning, about that house, about what we heard, and why, when we broke in to save them, there was nothing. The storm came in fast, faster than the charts predicted. We were off diving a small research vessel, just me and my wife, Lena. Our last trip before she transitioned out of the field for good. She said her body couldn't take the pressure anymore, but I think she just got tired of chasing shadows at the bottom of the sea. We were hunting sound. Not whales or seismic shifts. A tone. An anomaly that kept showing up on deep sea recorders off the Mariana Shelf. Lena had found it on an old Navy hydrophone archive. It was from the 90s, and she became obsessed. She called it the lullaby. We had one shot to drop in before the storm swallowed us. She begged to go with me. She said that she wanted to hear it with her own ears, and she did. About 2,000 feet down, the ocean stopped sounding like water. No wails or rumblings going about, just this long, low tone, almost warm, like it knew we were there. I felt it in my teeth. She grinned through her mask like a kid at Christmas, and then she whispered, "It's beautiful." And I remember thinking, whispered? We weren't on comms. And that's when my light died, and then hers, and that tone changed. It wasn't warm anymore. It was closer and layered, like there was something behind it, a presence. We held our position and tried not to panic, but then something moved, just outside the lights, a shimmer, a glint, and the tone. It began mimicking our breathing. I swear on my life, it synced to her first, like it was trying to calm her or lull her. Lena went limp, like she was in a trance, started drifting toward the edge of the trench wall. I grabbed her arm, and something was pulling her. I kicked, yanked her back. She screamed, not in pain, in rage. "Let go of me," she cried. How could I hear that? I managed to trigger the emergency ascend, pulling both of our suits upward toward the surface. But halfway up, she fought me, kicking at me, tried to shut off her own suit ballast. She kept muttering, "Don't take me away from them." When we finally made it back to the boat and were in a dire rush to make it back to shore as the storm started, I asked Lena, "What happened down there?" She told me she heard my voice. She heard me calling for her. Said she didn't remember fighting me, didn't remember trying to go toward the trench. We really have no idea what the hell happened out there. But it wasn't just Lena's last time in the water. I decided to hang it up as well. The sea is vast, and there's so much to see. But I've decided there's just as much to see on land. At least up here, I've got some sort of advantage. I grew up along the coast of Georgia, just a short drive from the marshes. People always said the water held things, old memory, bad energy, sometimes even spirits. I never really believed any of it until one night about 10 years ago. I was out near the St. Mary's River, helping a friend bring in some crab pots before a storm rolled in. It was late, maybe close to midnight. and the wind was already picking up. The tides were high, and the air had that thick, charged feeling, the one it gets before a bad storm. As we were pulling in the last trap, I noticed something out past the reeds, standing just barely in the water. It looked like a person, tall, still, pale in the moonlight. I thought it was someone else out there checking traps, until I realized they weren't moving, just standing there in the water. No swaying with the wind, not reacting at all. My buddy saw it too. We both stopped talking and just stared for a few seconds. Then the figure slowly sank down. No splash, no movement, just slipped beneath the water. The storm hit hard the next morning. Torn up docks, power outages, a couple of boats flipped over in the marina. I've only told a few people about what I saw. Everyone says the same thing. He saw a storm spirit. Around here, it's not unheard of. People say if you see something strange in or near the water before a storm, you better take it seriously. Now I do. Every time I see the tide rise a little too quick, or the air gets too still, I remember that pale figure, like I can't get it out of my mind, but I don't waste any time getting inside. In the Gulf of Alaska, I've seen some shit, but one of the most terror-inspiring things I've seen are what can happen with some of those loose logs from a logging trade. Sometimes when a big log gets loose from a raft, it becomes partially waterlogged and floats small end up. So you have this 4-foot diameter telephone pole in the sea, sticking up 40 feet into the air. No biggie. Shows up on radar, easy to spot. Now give that pole 20 years of floating around or so. It rots in such a way that it becomes filed to a point by wind and waves, and it looks quite menacing, like giant spears. Now, put it in a gale with 25-foot waves, and it becomes a towering spike of death that shoots up from the sea every 15 to 20 minutes, out of nowhere, 60 feet into the air, only to plunge down into the dark depths, waiting to skewer some unsuspecting boat in a few minutes when it thrusts out of the ocean again. It's a genuinely terrifying sight, rare, but not so rare that I haven't seen 2 in one season. It's just such a random terror that has the opportunity to fuck your shit up in a particularly terrifying way. I was swimming in the ocean with a friend when I saw something floating in the water nearby us. I knew what it looked like to me, but it was a bit transparent. I asked my friend if he saw anything floating a few feet away from us and pointed to where I was seeing it. He said he didn't see anything, and then he asked me what I saw. I told him I could see what looked like a woman's body floating face down, naked, with long red hair. He was understandably freaked out and wanted to get out of the water immediately. We went inside, changed, and started preparing dinner. His roommate came home, and while we were all sitting around talking, I started asking his roommate some questions about his job as a criminal defense attorney. As the conversation went on, I asked him if he ever had to defend anyone he knew on serious charges. He said yes, actually, after a friend of his was charged with murder when his wife's body washed ashore, right in front of this very condo 12 years ago. I looked over at my friend, and he was 50 shades of pale, with his jaw on the floor. Then I asked his roommate to describe what she looked like. He said that she had very long red hair, and that she was found naked, lying face down on the beach. I let my friend explain what had happened earlier that day. They were both stunned. I was working sonar on a research vessel about 200 miles off the coast of Chile. We were mapping trenches, nothing flashy, just weeks of slow grid passes over black nothing. We'd been picking up odd returns for a couple of days, but nothing that we could confirm. That night, I was alone in the control cabin when I caught it. A deep ping from below. A return signal that wasn't ours. Not just noise. Rhythmic. Intentional. 4 pings. Then silence. 4 pings again. I radioed it in, but no one responded. And then I realized I hadn't heard anything on the comms in over 30 minutes. Not even static. I left the cabin and headed toward the galley. The halls were empty. Lights flickered. But that wasn't unusual. Power systems on the ship were old and faulty at times. The thing is, the whole ship was dead quiet. No footsteps, no engine hum. Just quiet. I reached the bridge. No one. No one on deck either. Just me. I tried the emergency phone. Dead. The escape boat. Still tied. Untouched. But the crane controls were active. Then the pings started again. Closer. I looked over the rail. I saw something massive surfacing. It didn't break the water, just shadows shifting underneath. A shape that never fully revealed itself. And then there was a sound. It wasn't mechanical or natural. I ran. I didn't stop running. Locked myself in the lower hull until morning. At sunrise, everyone was back. Eating breakfast. Like nothing had happened. No one remembered anything. Not the pings, not the silence. But when I pulled the sonar logs, those 4 pings were still there. And at 4:32 a.m., there was a 5th. For reasons that I'm sure will become obvious, the names in this story have been changed. My dad was a chef for a very wealthy family from 1972 through the summer of 81. He was one of 3 in-house chefs. They would each rotate staying in one of the guest rooms for a week to be on call for anything this family may request at any hour. During the summertime, they would pay my dad extra to accompany them on their yacht, continuing his duties as chef while they'd travel the northern Atlantic for weeks at a time. At the end of one of these trips, my dad returned home carrying a pillowcase. Being the nosy kid I was, I looked inside and saw more money than I'd ever seen in my life. That night, my dad tells my mom that he no longer works for the family, that we'd be moving to Cleveland the very next morning. That night, as my parents fought in the other room, I gathered my favorite things, trying to keep as much as possible. As I listened through the wall, I could tell it was serious. My mom was crying. My dad was crying. All night I watched as they packed as much as they could fit inside our suitcases. Everything else was left behind. I was too young to understand the gravity of what was happening around me. Too young to pack my own suitcase. We arrived at the airport some ungodly hour in the morning, landed in Cleveland also in the morning. For the first 2 months, all of us stayed in a small motel until my dad found us a house in Jefferson. The pillowcase stash of money was more than enough to support us while my dad found a new job. Though I was young, I knew this was a dark time. My parents asked me not to tell any of the kids where I'd come from. They didn't even want me to use my real last name. I was of the ask no questions age, went along with this for a good percentage of my life. Years later, I was looking through an old photo album when I saw a Polaroid of me and my dad standing on that family's yacht. I remember my mom took that picture before he left to wherever he was going that time. Then I was reminded of that striped pillowcase full of money my dad had brought home all those years ago. I took the Polaroid out of the sticky clear album page, brought it to my dad to ask about the family and the random sack of cash. He told me before I was born he worked in the kitchen of a pretty luxurious casino back where we originally came from. There he met one of the owners who enjoyed his culinary skills so much, he hired him as a personal chef. We'll call him Eddie. Eddie had multiple lines of revenue he'd pursue on top of his casino earnings. Some of his associates and people he considered his friends were a couple high-ranking members of the Latin Kings and an unnamed MC from a couple of states west. My dad said almost immediately after he took the gig, he was looking for ways out. He'd almost predicted that something bad was going to happen, but he could never make a clean exit. Unfortunately, and fortunately for him, Eddie liked him a lot, his cooking even more. On occasion, Eddie would host a poker night on his yacht, invite them and their families. Those big excursions, my dad had the 2 other cooks with him, but this trip was different. There was a small crew on board for what was supposed to be a 3-day trip down the South Atlantic. The guests Eddie was hosting were his brother Robert, who my father had also become friends with over the years. He was a commercial fisherman and would drive the yacht, as well as a business partner named Wade, described as a small, nervous-looking man. My father smoked cigars with the men and wondered why he was on the boat that day. He'd only met Wade once before, when he'd attended a birthday party at Eddie's house. On their first night out at sea, Robert drops the anchor and they sit idle. My dad goes to the upper level to start the grill and prepare dinner for everyone. That's when he hears arguing from the men on the lower deck. The arguing gets louder. Sounds like it turns physical. Dad stares over the railing to the fight below. Wade's outnumbered by the brothers. He sees Robert restraining Wade's arms from behind. As Eddie punches the wind out of him, a left hook to the stomach sends Wade to the ground. My dad silently winces for Wade, only briefly closing his eyes. He opens them and he sees Robert pick Wade back up. Just enough time for him to scream, "Please don't," before Eddie shoots him at point-blank range. Immediately, my father closed his eyes, but couldn't bring himself to move. He could hear Robert and Eddie pull up the anchor, tie Wade's body directly to the metal slab, before they dragged it off the back of the boat. My father was sure he was going to be killed next. Instead, when they saw my father standing frozen on the upper deck, they insisted that he continue dinner as they cleaned up this mess. Their literal words. The 3 men shared a steak dinner that night in the yacht, idled by an anchor with Wade's body fastened tightly against it. Eddie remorsefully explains to my father that he and Robert had to do this. Wade had been trying to give tribal police some information on the casino, and it was rumored that Wade had made some less than favorable advances towards Eddie's teenage daughter. Unfortunately for Wade, Eddie had most of the tribal police department under his payroll, and he really loved his daughter. The officer called Eddie the moment Wade left his office. Robert thought that Wade would be too suspicious to get on the yacht if he didn't see my dad on board. They were both very apologetic for involving my dad, using him as a pawn of sorts. Without changing his sympathetic tone, Eddie says that he and Robert need to leave the country for a while, and that my dad and his family will have to leave the state. Eddie wasn't worried about my dad snitching. After all, he made it clear that he knew my family very well, where we lived, went to school, my parents' names. He assured my dad he could and would find us if necessary. On the boat before they docked, Eddie filled the pillowcase full of money from 2 safes inside the yacht. With an overly firm handshake, he wished my dad safe travels. My father looked for weeks. Nothing ever popped up about Wade. No missing persons. Nothing. It was sort of surreal listening to this story firsthand. With both my parents deceased now, it's definitely worth a retelling. I do marine salvage operations in the Pacific. Until recently, I never imagined doing anything else. Now I'm looking into any career that keeps me away from the ocean. I don't even like going to the beach anymore. A couple of months ago, we were contacted by a well-known company that wouldn't like being named, but you've definitely heard of them. In 2014, they lost contact with a ship that was only 8 days into its route, and it was never heard from again. Search and rescue teams made every effort to locate the missing vessel, but ultimately they had to accept the loss. This left a lot of families without closure and cost the company millions. But that was the end of it, until this year when the wreckage was discovered by chance. Once it was identified, we were hired. In this case, so much time had passed that any human remains would be long gone, and the cargo would be useless. This was mostly about closure and publicity. These companies hire people like us with the hope that we'll find something to exonerate them, though, if they are to blame, they simply won't share the report. We spent the first day doing recon, hoping to see an obvious reason for why the ship sank, but we couldn't find anything wrong with her, except for the obvious damage caused by being submerged. But if they were attacked or taken by a sudden storm, there would be recognizable signs. On day 2, we entered the wreckage in search of the voyage data recorder, which is just a ship's version of the little black box. We found it exactly where it was supposed to be, and our techs were able to recover the data for the vessel's last 48 hours afloat. I've spent most of my life at sea. I've experienced things that will haunt me for the rest of my life, but this is the one that convinced me to retire. The box records all of the ship's instrument readings, along with audio recordings from the bridge. For whatever reason a ship might sink, there will be certain indicators from the instrument readings alone, but not this time. Everything was operating perfectly up until the ship's final seconds. The only abnormal findings came from the bridge recordings. They began with the captain asking a crewman if he was able to find the child. It didn't make any sense. No children were listed on the manifest, and they generally aren't found on cargo ships. After listening to the whole thing, we were even more confused, but we pieced it together as best we could. Needless to say, you won't be hearing about this in the news. The company decided to keep this information private. From what we can tell, a young girl, roughly 10 years old, was on board, but no one knew how she got there. They assumed she was a homeless stowaway due to her torn clothes and dirty appearance. But you could tell they didn't believe it. They sounded afraid of her. One crewman reported following a rotten smell to the cargo hold, where he heard a child crying, thinking she didn't hear him. He tried to approach quietly in an attempt to corner her between containers, only when he got to the end of the row, nobody was there, and the crying stopped instantly. The only thing left where the child should have been was a small pot of black tar-like substance that was identified as the source of this rotten smell. There was also talk of a bad luck streak that coincided with the girl's appearance when the captain received news of another accident. One of the cooks severed the top of their finger at the knuckle while chopping veggies, swore that somebody had grabbed his hand. I expected this claim to be met with skepticism, but instead, it was compared to a crewman who broke his ankle while descending a ladder. He'd felt someone grab the back of his shirt and pull hard, causing him to fall backwards. His foot became trapped between the rungs. The problem with his story is that nobody else was around, and there was nowhere to hide in the small corridor. The ship's final day began with reports of another sighting. This time, the girl was seen roaming the corridors to the sleeping quarters. They reported dark, muddy water was pouring from her eyes and mouth like a faucet. But when additional men were sent back to investigate, everything was completely dry. The captain called for yet another full search of the ship. Every nook was methodically searched, but there was no evidence of the girl. It was like she snuck on board with nothing but the clothes on her back. Just hours later, a crewman reported that the cargo hold was ankle-deep underwater, but there were no signs of a hull breach. They weren't transporting any liquids. All of the instruments appeared to be operating perfectly. The crew was stumped. The water was rising quickly. Eventually, the captain was forced to give the orders to abandon ship. They had enough space in the lifeboats to carry double their numbers, and they had more than enough time to safely escape. But the lifeboats were gone. They'd been there the previous day, but in the morning's panic, no one realized they were missing until it was too late. They couldn't even call for help. Every attempt to use the radio was met with nothing but static. Ultimately, the crew waited on deck until the last second, when they were forced to take their chances in the open water. All except for the captain, who chose to go down with his ship. I think he fully understood how hopeless their chances were and preferred a quicker end. There's no telling how long the others survived or how much they suffered. The captain spoke once more before falling silent forever. In his final moments, he spoke of seeing the girl. She came to thank him for staying with her. She'd been lonely for a very long time, but they became friends. Any skeptics who hear that recording will probably blame a dying man's hallucinations, including me. That's because it's much better than the truth. It's better to tell yourself that and forget this whole story than to admit the soft voice of a child can be heard in the background. It's faint, but if you turn the volume up to max, it's there. My buddy and I were deep diving off the coast of Japan, exploring part of an old wreck that hadn't been touched in a long time. Commercial dive, routine inspection. Nothing was out of the ordinary. About 70 meters down, I spotted a section of hull that none of us had noticed on the sonar. It was covered in coral and rust, almost like it didn't want to be found. But at the base of the wreck, nestled in the sand, was a small round hatch. It didn't match the rest of the ship. It had no wiring, no bolts, no handles, just perfectly round, and this greenish-black film coating it. Naturally, I radioed it in. Got told to leave it alone, so of course I tapped it with my boot. Nothing happened. Not at first. Then the tank started vibrating, just slightly, like a hum. My partner asked if I was okay. I lied, said I was fine. The humming got louder inside my helmet, and then I heard a voice. Not over comms, not external, just inside. Not really words either, just a feeling. Like something was trying to remember me, talk to me. I turned back to the hatch. It was open, just barely a crack, but it had opened without a sound. The sand hadn't even shifted. Nothing had been disturbed and the sea was still. And then something reached out. It wasn't a hand or a tentacle. It was just darkness. Like the water itself had thickened, reaching toward me, curling. I bolted. My partner thought I'd lost it. I didn't stop ascending until I broke the surface and puked into my mask. I didn't go back down. Ever. They say the hatch wasn't there when they checked the wreck again. Sonar shows nothing. Video shows nothing. But I saw something. My favorite things to do have always been swimming and exploring, so it's no wonder that I became obsessed with scuba diving and caving. I was 12 when my dad started taking me to do these things, but I didn't go into my first underwater cave until I was 18. After that, I went to as many as I could, as often as I could go. I had no problem exploring the same one over and over. There are some close to where I grew up, and I know them as well as my own home. I'm 36 now, and in all those years, I've never had any close calls or seen anything unusual until my trip to Hawaii. You can see many of their underwater caves on Google, but you won't find the one that I'm talking about. And I'd rather not say exactly where it is, so Don't ask. I don't want to be responsible for someone else going down there when I barely made it out. A few days into my trip, I met some locals who told me about a spot that I wouldn't find on the maps. They were planning to go that weekend, were kind enough to invite me to go along. Unfortunately, I was too excited to wait. They warned me not to go alone, but I knew I could find it based on their description. I only intended to explore the entrance. I was never planning to take any risks. I even left most of my equipment behind so I wouldn't be tempted. But this cave was unlike anything I've ever seen. It's not uncommon to find air pockets in these types of places. But that's usually what they are, pockets. Smaller spaces where the water doesn't reach the cave's roof. If you're lucky, there will be a ledge or somewhere to rest without having to use your oxygen supply. But, barring a few exceptions, that's about it. This cave was the mother of all exceptions. I swam to the other end and found that what I thought would be a good resting ledge, but it wasn't. Once I got out of the water, I saw the ledge actually went further than my flashlight could reach. I kept walking, thinking each step would suddenly reveal the end, but it never came. I don't know how long it actually took, but I walked much further than intended. When I finally reached the other side, there was no wall, just more water. I immediately wanted to jump in and keep exploring, but I suddenly got a horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach. The feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. The coldest chills of my life spread through my body. I've had friends get creeped out like that sometimes. It just never happened to me. But whatever this was, I could feel it in my bones. I carefully surveyed my surroundings while trying to calm down. That's when I noticed another ledge across the water. After a short debate with my better judgment, I decided it was safe enough to swim across and continue exploring the other side. That's when I heard footsteps. My stomach traded places with my heart. It sounded like something very large was dragging its feet and getting closer. But when I shined my light in that direction, the sound stopped. That's when the real fear hit me. If something else was down there, trying to sneak up on me, they only had bad intentions. Knowing I had to leave quickly, I kept my light trained on the opposite ledge, in hopes of gaining a little extra distance as I backed away, and a huge pair of red eyes appeared. They were only visible for a brief second before fading back into the darkness, but they definitely weren't human. Even if they hadn't been red and glowing, no one has eyes that big or that far apart. Whatever they belonged to was massive, and I didn't want to meet it. Eventually, my light fell short of the opposite ledge, and a loud splash came immediately after. That thing had jumped into the water to continue its pursuit, and I panicked. I turned and began running as a deafening roar erupted behind me. It made no other sound as it swam across, but it arrived at the other side faster than any human could have. Next, I heard its claws tearing into the rock wall as it climbed onto the ledge, and I fully believed I was going to die there. As the sound of its pursuing footsteps grew closer with each second, I was tempted to turn and face the beast before it killed me. If I was going to die, I deserved to know what my killer looked like, but I was too afraid. Another low growl echoed the cave. Tears filled my vision. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the end just ahead, and somehow I'd made it. I barely had enough self-control to enter the water properly, but I'd been through too much to let stupid mistakes kill me now. I swam like a madman, fully expecting a large splash to follow right behind me, but it never came. After a short distance, I stopped with the realization that I would spend the rest of my life wondering if what I experienced was real or some kind of break from reality. So I resurfaced once more, without the flashlight. Everything was pitch black, the kind of dark where you can't see your hand in front of your face. All except for two glowing red orbs in the distance. I couldn't make out anything else, not even the shape of the owner's head. They were completely still, until they suddenly rose several feet higher, like how a snake will stand straight up. It's hard to guess the height even at that angle, but at the very least, it was much taller than a human. Needless to say, it was a while before I went into another cave, and it certainly wasn't that one. I'm finally ready to talk about the reason I went back to school last year. Before that, I was working on fishing boats. I don't have a wife or kids, so my time is my own. People always thought that it was weird that I enjoyed spending long stretches at sea, but I always thought that it was weird that they didn't. I figured it was one of those to each their own kind of things, but maybe they knew something I didn't, or just had better instincts. Most of the companies work similar to oil rigs. You go out with your crew for a few weeks, and then you come home to be off for a few weeks. I enjoyed my time off the same way that I did my time on, at sea. For every big industry boat, there are just as many day fishers. And it wasn't uncommon for me to help one out if they fell short-handed. Well, one morning during the summer of 22, I headed down to the docks in hopes of setting out with one of my day crews. My usual guys didn't have any openings, but I did notice a few summer boys arguing over where to find the gas tank, so I decided to introduce myself. Rich kids on college break were my favorite employers. There's no real work to do, so it's basically a babysitting gig. These guys wanted to take out Daddy's boat to get some good pictures for Instagram, but then they got to the docks and didn't know what to do next. There were 3 of them, but I probably shouldn't use their real names, so the owner's son can be Chad, and his buddies can be Sam and Dan. After gassing up, I made my sales pitch and they invited me right along. The only thing they cared about was catching one of those swordfish things, and being back before dark. The home before dark part was a piece of cake, but I'll circle back to the marlin stipulation in a minute. I would have gone for free, but I didn't argue when they gave me $500. It was just before 8 a.m. when we left the dock for a small island that local kids sometimes use for parties. But people never go beyond that point because the other side is surrounded by jagged rocks. One's hidden just beneath the surface. They'll put a hole in your hole before you realize what's happening, and they extend much further than you'd expect from such a small island. But the safe side is big. Like I said, kids party there all the time. I don't want it to sound like I recklessly took them to some dangerous location. We didn't even go to the actual island, only close enough to point it out. We anchored and began fishing around noon. Normally, I would have spent a good half hour explaining a few key differences between regular fishing and deep-sea fishing, but they had done zero research before the trip. With the bait that they had brought along, I didn't have to worry about them hooking a marlin or letting it get away with their poles. People like that never think about the fact that the fish will unhook itself. The first hour or so went exactly as I expected. Chad and Sam made some nice catches, but didn't want to touch the fish, so I kept taking them off the lines and rebaiting their hooks after the photo op. Dan, however, he learned to bait his own pretty fast because he kept getting robbed. It seemed like we had a good system worked out. After a few beers, I felt comfortable trying some of my own bait to see if I could catch the boys something worthy of posing with, but that turned out to be a nearly fatal mistake. While I was showing off to Chad and Sam, I realized Dan grabbed some of my bait, but even if I had, it really shouldn't have been that big of a deal. That just had to be the one time he set his hook properly. It was instantly clear that something was wrong when the entire boat lurched back hard enough to knock us on our asses. I shouted for Dan to let go, but he couldn't hear me over the loudest splash that I've heard in my life. I don't say that lightly. I've watched my captain fight a great white, and they make a hell of a fuss. but this sounded like a goddamn whale. I didn't need to see it to know that we were in danger. As I rose to my feet, there was a second giant splash and a hard impact to our starboard side, knocking us all back on our asses. I scrambled to Dan, half crawling, half running, screaming to let go all the while. But as I got closer, I saw that he had. It was stuck on the rails, and he had been trying to turn it so that it would slide through. That's why I usually cover these things before the fishing begins. Once the panic starts, it's hard to utilize common sense. I began screaming, cut it, instead. But the words fell dead on my lips when the coil of a giant, pale green serpent's body rose above the water and dropped onto the railing where the rod was stuck, smashing everything it impacted into splinters. The boat rocked to an almost 90-degree angle before slamming back into the water. Just before Dan could fall through the broken rails, I rushed to my feet to look over the side, just in time to see the last 6 feet of this tail disappear beneath the waves. I've spent my entire life on the ocean, but I've never seen anything like what we saw that day. It was like a giant anaconda left over from the Jurassic period. I've heard countless old sailors talk about creatures like it, but monster legends and sailing go hand in hand. Knowing what I do know now, it makes me wonder what other stories are true. And how many of the boating accidents by that island were actually from jagged rocks. Obviously, we returned to the docks immediately after that, but I haven't been able to go back out on the water since. I've always kind of been fascinated by the mysteries of the deep sea, so when the opportunity arose to scuba dive in the murky depths of the Puget Sound, I couldn't resist. I knew very little about scuba diving, but I'd had an instructor with me, 2 in fact, as well as a small group of other very beginner divers. It was a super misty morning. A layer of fog was still over the water when we'd walked our way in. I was from Everett, but Mukilteo practically sits right beside it, but it's got some of the most beautiful views and a spot well known for diving. Right between a beautiful hotel and some off-limits oil docks. The area is rather peaceful, to say the least, compared to the main beach or the lighthouse park. I found myself descending into the chilly waters off the coast. We weren't head under quite yet, but I could hardly wait to explore the world just beneath me and surrounding me. There was a period of time where I felt so comfortable I almost lost focus on the instructor and what they were saying. Luckily, it was all repeated. Finally, submerged. It was much quieter than I expected it to be. Only the sound of my own breathing through the gear mingled with the almost eerie silence. I navigated the underwater space through the kelp forests. I realized it was also darker than I expected. Everything, including myself, swayed with a gentle current. I was calm, and then I wasn't. An unexplainable unease began to settle within me. It was as if an invisible force would snatch me into the darkness at any given moment. It felt as if I was being watched, for sure. I tried to tell myself, you're with people. It's probably just an actual person. Though I knew deep in my gut, the same gut screaming for me to get away. There wasn't a fellow diver in those dark shadows of the water, but someone, something, watching my every move, was in the shadows. Just as I was about to resurface, a spectral figure materialized before me, underneath the surface. The ghostly apparition was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Translucent and ethereal, much lighter than the shadow it seemed to emerge from. It shimmered with an otherworldly glow. And at first, I thought it was some sort of jellyfish, but I saw its eyes, as piercing as any bright light. Just for a moment, they were fixed on me. causing me to increase my speed to the surface. Still, I was so curious about what I'd seen. Surely those weren't eyes. Now that I'd had a moment to think, I considered that maybe I had in fact seen another diver, that the light had been their headlamp, too, somehow. I didn't have mine on at the time, but maybe I should have. I lowered myself closer to the seabed, trying to capture a glimpse of its presence again. But as I descended, to my sheer horror, the apparition was directly in front of me. At first, I thought it was mirroring my movements, but I realized, whatever it was swimming away. I rose to the surface again, realizing most of the divers were to the northeast of me. I was the furthest back. I swam closer to the group and descended underwater. I realized even from a distance the divers were much clearer. I could see their details clearly underwater. They weren't remotely transparent or shimmering in any way. I decided to try my luck one more time. I swam back in the direction I just explored, but I felt someone grab my leg. I was completely unprepared for the sensation, and it caused me to panic underwater. Summoning some remaining courage, I propelled myself away from the grip on my leg, my heart pounding in my chest. And even though I had oxygen, I felt like I couldn't breathe, like I needed air. I felt it again, a strong pull on my leg. The water's current seemed to conspire against me, suddenly pushing me further into the sound, away from the safety of the surface, further away from the rest of the group. Just as I thought all hope was lost, an eerie stillness settled around me. There was no longer a grip on my leg, and I seized the opportunity to swim upwards with all of my might. Breaking through the surface and touching shore, I removed my headgear and gasped for air. Up to that point in life, I'd almost drowned twice. Been stung by a kind of jellyfish that hurt, and been thrown from a four-wheeler into a metal shed. But at that moment, my body was trembling with a mixture of adrenaline and relief like I'd never felt before. I don't doubt that the Puget Sound is a beautiful ecosystem worth exploring, and it's got several good spots. I've just never been back to that spot in particular. The memory of the underwater encounter, it's still vivid in my mind. I decided that I didn't really need to know what it was. Honestly, the moment it tried to pull me under or away, just pull it all, I was done. The flooding started slow enough that no one panicked. We'd had days of heavy rain, nothing unusual for where I live. But that night it just didn't stop. The sound of it was constant, like someone dragging chains across the roof. Around midnight, my phone started buzzing with alerts that I didn't bother opening. I'd grown numb to those. They always came too late or exaggerated things that never reached us. I lived alone in a small house near a creek. It wasn't waterfront exactly, but close enough that I'd always half joked that it might someday become one. I woke up at 2 a.m. to the sound of knocking. At first, I thought it was debris hitting the house. Branches, trash cans, something swept up by the water. But it was more soothing or rhythmic. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. I checked the windows before going to the door. The porch light showed nothing but rain in a dark, rippling shape where my yard used to be. The water had reached the steps. The knocking came again, louder this time. When I opened the door, the water rushed forward just enough to soak my shoes. Standing there was a woman I didn't recognize. She was drenched, her hair plastered to her face, wearing a pale nightgown that clung to her like wet paper. She didn't look panicked, and that's what struck me first. "Can I come in?" she asked. Her voice was calm, almost bored. I hesitated. Every warning you're taught tells you not to open your door in a storm, not to invite strangers inside. But the water was rising fast, and she was standing in it like she didn't feel the cold at all. She stepped past me before I'd answered. The moment she crossed the threshold, the smell hit me. Stagnant water, rot, something metallic like pennies. She stood in my living room, dripping onto the rug, looking around as if she were taking inventory. "You should go upstairs," she said. "The water always comes up faster than you think." Something about the way she said "always" made my stomach twist. I asked her where she came from. She tilted her head, considering the question like it didn't quite apply. "Downstream," she said. I grabbed towels, handed her one. She didn't take it. The water dripping from her never slowed. The creek breached its bank 15 minutes later. The water poured into the house with a force that I wasn't prepared for. I ran upstairs, yelling for her to follow me, and she didn't. From the landing, I watched her stand there as the water rose around her legs, waist, chest. She didn't struggle. She didn't reach for anything. She just watched me with that same calm expression. When the water reached her throat area, I saw her smile. Then she went under. I screamed her name, though I'd never learned it. I somehow knew it. Gail. I called 911 with shaking hands. Rescue boats came at dawn. They searched the house, the flooded yard, the creek. They didn't find a body. Later, while staying with a friend, I had to look up the flood records for the area. There was a photograph from decades ago, black and white, of a house that used to stand downstream from mine. A woman stood on a porch in a pale nightgown, water lapping at her feet. The caption said that she refused to evacuate. Her body was never recovered. But it was Gail. I wasn't supposed to be alone that night. It was a simple overnight trip. Just a short sail, drop anchor, crack a few beers with my cousin Evan, and be back in the morning. He bailed last minute, said his kid had a fever. I should have rescheduled, but I'd already prepped the boat and the forecast was clear, so I went. Just me, a borrowed sailboat, and the open water off the Florida Keys. It was calm at first. I anchored a few miles out, watched the sunset, made myself a drink, even dozed off under the stars. But sometime after midnight, the wind kicked up hard. I jolted awake to the sail flapping violently and the waves slamming against the hull. The sky had gone black. No stars, no horizon, just chaos. I tried to pull the anchor and power back, but I was too late. One rogue wave hit broadside and flipped the boat. I surfaced, disoriented and gasping. The boat was upside down. I managed to climb onto the hull, soaked and shaking, with nothing but the emergency light clipped to my vest. No radio, no flare gun. My phone was somewhere at the bottom of the ocean. So I waited. The hours passed slowly. The wind died, but the water didn't calm. Every little splash made my heart jump. I shouted at passing shadows that turned out to be nothing. At one point, I saw lights, distant and bouncing, like a boat's mast, but they faded. No one came. Then came the voice. At first I thought I was imagining it. Delirium, maybe, but it was clear and close. "Hey, over here." A woman's voice, young, crisp. I turned in every direction, nothing but waves and sky, and then again. "Help me, please." It was so close it sounded like it was coming from the water itself. "Where are you?" I yelled. No answer. Hello? Silence. And then, splash. A few feet off the starboard side, something broke the surface. Just a ripple. I leaned forward, squinting into the dark. Help me. The same voice, behind me now. I spun around, but the water was empty. It just kept happening. Every few minutes the voice called again, always from a new direction. Always panicked. Always too close. But the worst part was, I recognized it. It wasn't until the third or fourth time that it clicked. It was my sister's voice. But that was impossible. She was thousands of miles inland. Over here, Danny. She used my name next. I almost swam away from the boat. I don't know what stopped me. Maybe the rhythm of everything. Every call sounded exactly the same. Same inflection, same timing. Like a recording on a loop. Like it didn't understand how real people would speak. But it knew enough to sound like my sister. Around dawn, a Coast Guard chopper finally spotted me. And I wept the whole way into the basket. The guy strapped to me asked if I was injured. I just kept saying, "Did you hear her? Did you hear the voice?" They just said no, just wind and water. They never found anyone else in the area. No other boats were reported missing. No swimmers, no divers, nothing. They chalked it up to trauma or shock. But a voice. I'm fine now, mostly. I don't go out into the water anymore. Not even really ferry rides. I moved away from the coast and found a job inland. But of course, I'll never really be able to let go of the weirdness of the story. Even if it was my mind playing tricks on me, it really creeps me out. The ocean used to be my favorite place until last summer when I almost drowned. Growing up, my parents would take my brother and I to a small reef where we would swim and snorkel all day. Now that I'm an adult, I occasionally take friends out to do the same thing, only with the addition of alcohol. The boat ride is only 40 minutes from shore, and we've never seen a shark out there. We rarely even saw other people. On this particular day, it was just me and my girlfriend, and this was already pretty routine for us. As usual, we were snorkeling, screwing around, when she noticed a baby sea turtle with a fishing line trailing behind it. This is a sadly common occurrence, and we couldn't just leave it that way. Sometimes they get tangled in a net, or just get so wrapped up that you have to cut through thick layers, so I always keep a good knife on me while in the water. The turtle was making its way to the deeper parts of the reef, so I took a deep breath and hurried after it while my girlfriend waited at the surface. I caught the little guy just as he tried to crawl into a dark crevice near the sea floor. Luckily, the fishing line was easy to remove, and I sent him on his way without needing to go up for air. But I was at my limit. I stepped onto the large rock and pushed off to speed my ascent. As I began to slow, I glanced down just in time to see a massive brown tentacle shoot out of the reef wall and wrap around my leg. It looked like the reef itself had come to life. The tentacle was double the thickness of my thigh, and in a split second, it wrapped my leg from ankle to knee. It took all of my self-restraint not to scream out what precious oxygen I had left. That's when I noticed a huge section of the reef wall moving, and I saw its eyes open. It was like a giant, monster octopus, perfectly camouflaged to match its surroundings. I could have stared at that spot all day and never noticed anything unusual if it hadn't grabbed me. My leg was completely numb. My lungs were on fire. I knew that I would lose any slim chance of survival if I started choking, so I took my knife and I began desperately stabbing at the tentacle. Black ink instantly spread through the water, and I heard a shrill scream that, to this day, I still can't be sure if it belonged to this giant octopus or my girlfriend. It was about that time that she saw the black ink spreading from the surface and came to see what was happening. I didn't see her. I only felt a sharp tug on the back of my shirt as she was pulling me to the surface. We didn't stick around to look for the octopus. We just hurried onto the boat and got away from that place. Only after we gained some distance did I stop to explain what happened and look at my leg. I stabbed myself twice and had to get over 30 stitches afterwards. But aside from that and a touch of PTSD, I was fine. Obviously, we've never gone back and don't intend to, but I just have to know. Has anyone else seen an octopus that size? Was it even an octopus? Could it have been anything else? When I was about 12, I got the opportunity to stay with my friend and her family who lived on a boat. They traveled to many locations on the boat for many years, but this story, we were in Jamaica for a week. The mini vacation started off so fun. We were in the pool or at the beach back and forth every day, all day. But on the third day, I started seeing enormous snakes in the water, just looking at me, blinking with their big eyes. I remember I was stepping over into the boat. I could see a huge snake diving down into the water. It creeped me out. I couldn't sleep and I didn't want to go swimming in the ocean anymore. The family took notice that I didn't want to go into the ocean, so they decided that maybe a river would be fun. I remember on the journey I was contemplating in my mind if it would be safe or not. When I got to the river and looked around, I didn't see any snakes, so I was ecstatic. I started stripping down to my swimsuit, ran right into the river, swam across to a cliff, climbed up the cliff, getting ready to dive off. But when I looked down, there was a snake staring at me, blinking. I touched a guy and a girl beside me and I said, "Do you see that?" The guy said, "What?" and just jumped in the river. The girl looked at me and said, Yes, I see it," with a scared tone to her voice. I looked at her. I saw the fear in her eyes, but I wanted to make sure that I wasn't going crazy, so I said, "What exactly do you see?" And she said, "The big snake." I looked at her in such shock, but I also had a sense of relief. We were stuck at the top of the cliff. People came and just jumped off, but every time we looked down, we regretted that we looked. I don't know what would have happened if I jumped off like those other people, but I wasn't brave enough to test it. So I did what I thought was best for both of us. I cried. I cried in fear, and my friend's dad came for me and the other girl. I remember asking the girl if this was the first time she'd seen them, the snakes. I remember her saying no. She sees them all the time. Coming back from that trip, I never saw the snake again, but I still wonder what was the reason for them. Why was it just us who could see them? Any theories, anyone? This happened when me and my parents were on vacation to some place near Spain when I was still young. We went to a little beach at some coastal town, where I then immediately jumped into the ocean with my swimming goggles on. I then crawled onto some rocks and walked around until I noticed a crab sitting on the rocks. I then traversed them carefully while trying to catch it, but it kept crawling away. This continued until I then followed it to a point where the little bay I was in ended and the open ocean began. So then little me decided that it was a good idea to jump into the open water to see if there was anything cool down there. I then jumped in, and I was immediately hit with the cold temperature of the actual ocean water. But the worst part was that even with my goggles on, I couldn't see anything down there. I was met with a giant black void. No fish, no plants, no rocks, nothing. I then immediately turned around, began swimming back as quick as I could, and since that moment, I haven't gone beyond the shallows ever again. I came across a man who'd hung himself on his boat 5 or 6 miles offshore about 4 or 5 years ago. The eerie and truly creepy part was realizing what it was. We saw just a boat out in the middle of the ocean's nowhere, without anything other than blue horizon in sight. At the break of dawn, there was fairly thick fog, as it had rained the night before. Realizing that the figure hanging from the boom was a man was one of the most haunting things I've seen. A few years ago, I was out fishing in a 16-foot aluminum boat with a buddy of mine, just off the coast, calm waters, good weather, nothing out of the ordinary. We were anchored and chatting quietly when we noticed a disturbance in the water, way off in the distance. At first, it looked like a ripple or maybe a school of fish breaking the surface, but whatever it was getting closer, fast. Within a minute or so, we could see a large wake forming, bigger than anything we'd expect in that area. No boats around, no obvious cause, just a powerful rolling swell moving straight towards us. Before we had time to react, 3 massive whales glided silently beneath the boat, close enough to make the water chum. For a moment, it felt like we were standing on a paper boat. The water rose, shifted, and settled just as quickly as it came. It was incredible, and honestly a little terrifying, how effortlessly they moved beneath us, like shadows in deep water. Last year, my mate Danny and I took his speedboat out for a little ocean fishing. About 4 nautical miles east of harbor, we stopped the boat and cast out from opposite sides of the deck. Minutes later, Danny sets down his rod and rushes to the front of the boat. He grabs a pair of binoculars and looks back in the direction he's facing. I turn around and immediately see what he sees. From a distance, it looks like 2 men were sitting on a vessel that recently capsized. The keel floating above the waves, just enough for the men to sit on it to avoid the cold. Danny sets down the binoculars and throttles the boat to life. We start heading towards the distressed men. We cut the engine short of their overturned vessel to slow our approach as to not splash them with our waves. As our drift brought us closer, the shape of the men's features began to take form. My heart started to palpitate, noticing how similar their features resembled me and Danny. Danny walks to stand next to me when he sees what I see. We're both in disbelief, but the adrenaline of the situation prolonged our comprehension. Danny turns around to grab life jackets. I run to grab the life preserver. But when we meet back at portside, there's no longer anyone on the overturned boat. The keel was empty of its passengers, clinging to its wood, like they'd never been there. There was no sign of them anywhere. The capsized boat didn't disappear, but we watched it slowly continue to sink, until finally it was fully submerged. We watched it sink into the darkness. We waited for any remains of the wreckage to float up so we could identify and report it when we got back to shore, but nothing surfaced. Released oxygen bubbles didn't even float up after the boat sank. We were in a stunned silence. I made a comment about us just meeting a couple of ghosts, but Danny commented on their features, saying ghosts don't mimic. Whatever it was, we agreed it wasn't earthly, and it definitely wasn't good. An undoubtedly bad sign. So we decided to cut our fishing trip short and head back. On the way back, I was on the verge of tears without having any idea as to why, but I vividly remember feeling an overwhelming grip of sadness when we saw the men. A feeling I initially ignored because I thought that we had to rescue some stranded fishermen. And this feeling followed me all the way home. The air only truly felt clean the next day. It was like my energy was completely expended. Emotionally exhausted from a leisure trip. If you consider this paranormal, it was my only experience with otherworldly entities. Do spirits wander the ocean? Why did they look like us? I don't know if I believe in all the devil stuff, but I really can't classify all of this in another category. Any logical explanations? Decades ago, I took a midnight swim in the Atlantic Ocean. I'd gotten out pretty far, so I decided to turn around and look at the shore from where I was. All of a sudden, next to me in the water was a man. He said something like, "You're out a bit far, don't you think?" I responded that he was right, and then he said that I should head back to shore. I thanked him and swam back. When I got out of the water, I turned around to see if I could see him, but there was no one there. Why it never occurred to me to ask him to swim back as well, I'll never know. When I was in 3rd grade, me and my best friend Ricky were out at recess. The perimeter of our playground was surrounded by a chain-link fence. It was as tall as us, but in reality it only went up to the hips of the adults. On the other side of that was a marsh that swampy water pushed right up against the fence. The recess teachers shared a comically large pair of boots that they'd put on to retrieve the frisbees and sports balls that got thrown over. Anything smaller than a baseball or heavier than a tennis ball was considered lost because it was instantly swallowed by the muddy grassland. And the mosquitoes became unbearable the closer it got to summer. I knew my best friend since kindergarten. He was always chill, never got into fights with kids, and he listened in class. Impossible to distract. In retrospect, he most likely was a poster child for the positive effects of Adderall. Whatever it was, I'd never seen Ricky trip out, until the day that Ricky tripped out. He'd brought a toy from home, which was against the rules, but Ricky was too cool to care about the superficial ones. It was his toy, and he accepted the responsibility if anything happened to it. What he brought was a Japanese superhero. It looked like Ultraman, but an insect version of that guy. It had wings and a string that if you pulled it, it would spin the torso so the wings would catch air. It would hover like a helicopter. Ricky's very first demonstration of how it works, a swift rip of the cord leaves the string on Ricky's fingers and lifts the bug hero higher and higher into the sky. Then it began drifting further and further away from us. Anybody could predict exactly where it would go next. Well, anybody except 2 excited 3rd graders, mesmerized at the shiny colors on the propeller wings. Both of us watch as it gently glides over the chain-link fence and into the tall grass. It didn't look like it went too far out there, a few meters from the playground. When it went over, I stayed where I was, and Ricky ran off toward the fence. We knew the teachers out there weren't going to help us. But I wouldn't have guessed that Ricky would have been ballsy enough to hop the fence. After making sure that none of the teachers were paying attention, he climbed over. I was looking around, and so impressed that he got away with it. The kids and the adults alike were none the wiser. Ricky's cool points skyrocketed from that maneuver, and I asked myself, is this what being gay is? It wasn't, but it was the most badass thing I'd ever seen a kid do, and because he was my best friend, it made me the second coolest kid around. My weird fanboy moment was short-lived, however, lasting a couple seconds at most. After Ricky went into the tall grass out of view, the whole playground was alerted by his wailing, top of his lungs shrieks. All of the kids run to the fence, myself included. The recess teachers were close behind asking what's going on back there. Cool kids don't snitch, so I didn't. The sounds that were coming from the tall grass sounded like animals fighting, and a second growling voice started to match the first shrieks. The adults even suggested that that's what it was when they started moving us off the fence. Just animals. I was the only one that knew one of the voices was actually Ricky's, until he made one gargling last shout that clearly said, help. Hearing that it was a child on the other side, one of the younger teachers runs and hurdles the fence toward the noise. Then she starts screaming for one of the other teachers to call an ambulance. When she emerges from the grass, her clothes are covered in the sticky muck, and Ricky's in her arms, his body's hanging limp. She hands him to the teacher that didn't run for the phones, and they start performing CPR on him. When the first teacher gets back over the fence, she tells all of the kids to go to their classrooms, and I'm forced to join the group of classmates as they herd us like cattle back into the building. Our class watched the ambulance and police cars pull into the school parking lot. Our classroom didn't face the playground, so I wasn't able to find out what was going on with Ricky until the weekend. My mom drove me over to drop off the worksheets from the remaining days he missed that week. He was in his room, and it was the first time I'd seen him since he was dead on the playground. Ricky always had relatively long surfer hair, but when I showed up, he'd shaved it all off. He also had stitches in a moon shape on the top of his head. When I asked what happened, he made me promise not to tell anyone, and I did. But when he told me, it really freaked me out, and I believed him because he was my best friend and wouldn't make something like this up. The future crescent scar on his head would also add to the validity of his story. So what Ricky told me was that after he got over the fence, he stepped into the tall grass, and his shoes quickly sank into the mud as he tried to keep them from falling off of his feet. I think Ricky might be the first kid to ever see what was on the other side of that fence. He says that on the other side of the grass is an open wetland with a highway barely visible in the distance. He could see his toy stuck in the mud, but it was still pretty far away from him. So he slowly starts drudging through the mud towards it. But from behind another tall patch of grass that was even closer to the stuck toy, Ricky sees an old lady step out of the clearing. I asked what she was doing out there, but he said he didn't know. He was happy to see her, though. He asked her to throw him the spinner while thanking her a bunch as she made her way over to the toy. When she picked it up out of the mud, she held it out to Ricky, and again, he asks her to throw it. But she doesn't. She keeps it held in front of her, just staring back at him. Ricky was too polite to ask again, and instead began struggling in the mud to get over to her. She was maybe 3 or 4 meters away. He described her as a small, elderly woman, a long blue dress that hung off her bony, hunched back, and she had her hair tucked under a bandana. Ricky says that he had to use his arms to pull his legs out each time that he stepped. But after his first couple of steps forward, the marsh got deeper, and Ricky's legs sunk to the middle of his shins, making any progress nearly impossible. As he's trying to jiggle his legs free, he looks up at the old woman and sees her running at him in a full sprint, like the mud was less of an obstacle than her age. Telling me this part, Ricky starts pumping his arms as he described how fast she was coming at him, saying that she closed those meters in less than a couple of seconds. Ricky only had time to scream before the old woman was attacking him with incredible strength, trying to drown him in the mud. She yanked him around with so much force that she was actually pulling out chunks of his hair and scalp. The last breath that he had was used to scream. Then he says the woman was able to fully submerge his head. I asked why he didn't want to tell anyone, and he says he already tried, and it was just easier to say that he fell and continued sinking like quicksand, and parts of his hair also got stuck and were torn out on their own in the 20 centimeters of mud. That bland excuse seemed highly unlikely, but the true story sounded even more unlikely in comparison. Ricky always kept his hair short after that, partially because parts of his hair never regrew in a few baseball-size areas, and he had a bald pride phase in high school, where he thought he was the lead singer of Disturbed. But that's about it, though. We're all adults now. It's been a few decades since the incident, But I like to remind him of the secret he confided in me all of those years ago, and every so often I'll send him a text that says, "Remember when that old lady beat your ass to death?" You know, to show solidarity that I always believed he was telling the truth. Friendship is nice. Pick up your phone and text your best friend something offensive to show them you love them. The end.